It began not with thunderous battles or sprawling armies, but with the quiet arrival of trains pulling into a remote corner of southeastern Poland. On the outskirts of a small village called Belzec, the Nazis constructed a place that was not meant to imprison, not meant to enslave, but built solely for one purpose: extermination. Unlike Auschwitz, which became a complex of labor and death, Belzec was almost entirely devoted to mass killing. In less than a single year, from March to December 1942, nearly 500,000 men, women and children were transported here, and almost none would ever walk out again. To understand Belzec, we must first understand the world that made it possible. After the invasion of Poland in 1939, the Nazi regime sought not just conquest, but total domination of populations they deemed inferior. Ghettos swelled with Jewish families, starvation and disease spread, and the Nazi leadership grew restless with what they called the Jewish question. From Berlin came the orders for something far more radical. Belzec became the first laboratory of Operation Reinhard, the code name for the extermination of Polish Jewry. It was here that methods of mass murder were tested, refined and implemented with chilling efficiency, becoming the template for Sobibor and Treblinka that followed. The camp itself was deceptively simple: barbed wire fencing, wooden guard towers, barracks for SS men, and a few low, unremarkable buildings. But behind those walls, an industrial system of killing unfolded. At its heart were the gas chambers, initially crude wooden structures powered by carbon monoxide engines ripped from captured Soviet tanks. Victims were deceived with promises of showers, stripped of their belongings, and forced along what the SS cynically called the tube, a fenced, narrow path that led straight to their deaths. The screams, the engines, the silence afterward, these became the daily rhythm of Belzec. Yet, what makes Belzec stand out in the history of the Holocaust is not just its brutality, but its absence from public memory for decades. Unlike Auschwitz, it left behind few survivors. Fewer than 10 lived to tell the tale. The Nazis destroyed the camp, ploughed the ground, planted trees, and attempted to erase every trace of what had occurred. For years after the war, Belzec was almost forgotten, a place of unimaginable horror that the world barely noticed. But history does not forget. Survivor testimonies, archival documents, and archaeological research eventually uncovered the truth. Belzec was one of the deadliest places in all of human history, a silent graveyard where entire communities vanished in smoke and ash. Tonight we will retrace this story in full, from the ideological roots that created the camp, to the trains that delivered their human cargo, to the SS men who ran it, the victims who endured it, and the attempts to erase it. We will explore the origins of Operation Reinhard, the mechanics of the killing process, the lives of those who perished, the perpetrators who escaped justice, and the memorials that now stand in solemn remembrance. This is not just a story of a camp. It is a story of silence, of memory, and of why remembering Belzec is essential to remembering the Holocaust itself. And before we begin, I want to ask you, where are you tuning in from tonight? And what time is it where you are? I always love seeing how people from every corner of the world come together in this community to learn, reflect, and keep history alive. So settle in, get comfortable, and join me as we uncover the entire history of Belzec, the first Operation Reinhard camp, a place built for death, and a place the world must never forget. In the dark landscape of the Holocaust, certain names have become synonymous with unimaginable suffering: Auschwitz, Treblinka, Majdanek. Yet, among these, one camp has remained shrouded in relative obscurity: Belzec. Unlike Auschwitz, there were no vast industrial complexes or sprawling barracks preserved for the world to see. Unlike Treblinka, its destruction was so thorough that little evidence remained above ground. Belzec was the first fully operational extermination camp under Operation Reinhard, and its sole function was mass killing. Here no prisoners were meant to survive long. Almost every transport ended in immediate extermination. Between March and December 1942, roughly 500,000 human beings were systematically murdered at Belzec. Entire Jewish communities vanished into its gates, their voices silenced without memorial. Yet history often passes over Belzec, treating it as a footnote rather than a central chapter of genocide. This documentary aims to break that silence, to illuminate what was hidden, and restore its place in memory. To understand Belzec is to confront the terrifying efficiency of the Nazi machinery of death. While concentration camps like Dachau and Buchenwald were places of forced labor and brutal imprisonment, Belzec was designed from the start for extermination. The camp represented a terrifying escalation, a transition from persecution to mechanized genocide. Located in southeastern Poland, it was chosen deliberately, hidden away in a region where witnesses were scarce, yet connected by rail to ghettos bursting with victims. It became a prototype, the model upon which Treblinka and Sobibor were constructed. Unlike Auschwitz, there was no selection process for most arrivals. Survival was not an option, only death. This made Belzec unique, silent, efficient, horrifying in its singular purpose. In many ways it was the purest manifestation of the Nazi plan to annihilate entire peoples. And yet, despite its monstrous role, the world remembers little of it. Why is Belzec so forgotten? The reasons are both tragic and deliberate. The Nazis worked carefully to erase the evidence of their crimes here, dismantling the camp after its mission was complete. Buildings were torn down, mass graves were exhumed, corpses burned to ash, and the ground was ploughed and planted with trees. When Allied forces eventually reached this corner of Poland, almost nothing remained above the soil to bear witness. Equally important is the fact that there were almost no survivors. Historians estimate that fewer than 10 people lived to tell what happened at Belzec. Without survivors to testify, the story of Belzec slipped into silence for decades. Compared to Auschwitz, where thousands of witnesses spoke after liberation, Belzec became a ghost camp, known to specialists, but largely absent in public consciousness. This silence deepens the tragedy, for forgetting multiplies the loss. Yet for the Nazis, Belzec was a triumph of their cruel efficiency. Here they perfected methods of mass killing that would be replicated elsewhere. Christian Wirth, Odilo Globoknik, and other architects of Operation Reinhard tested gas chambers, honed deception techniques, and created a model of industrial slaughter. Trains arrived on tight schedules, unloading their human cargo into a process that lasted mere hours from arrival to death. Deception was central. Victims were told they were being resettled, urged to bathe, reassured until the last moment. Their belongings were stolen, their bodies disposed of, and the next transport arrived without pause. This relentless rhythm turned Belzec into a machine, devouring lives with terrifying speed. For the SS, it was proof that mass extermination could be carried out with chilling precision. For the victims, it was the end of entire communities, extinguished almost without trace. The scale of killing at Belzec defies comprehension. 500,000 souls perished here, most of them Jews from Galicia, Krakow and Lublin districts, along with Romani people and others deemed unworthy of life. In less than a year, villages that had been alive with centuries of culture were wiped off the map. The death toll at Belzec was second only to Auschwitz, and yet its story is rarely told. For many Jewish families, Belzec was the last destination, the point where their names disappeared from all records. Imagine trains arriving daily, filled with thousands, each group believing their nightmare might end upon arrival, only to be swallowed instantly into silence. The enormity of such destruction is staggering, and yet it is vital that it be narrated with precision and care. To speak of Belzec is to remember not statistics, but people, fathers, mothers, children, each robbed of their future. Belzec's obscurity also highlights the selective nature of collective memory. Auschwitz, with its preserved barracks and infamous gate, has become a symbol of the Holocaust. Treblinka, immortalized through survivor testimonies and memorials, also holds a place in remembrance. But Belzec, destroyed so completely, lacked physical ruins and survivor voices to force its way into consciousness. For decades after the war, it lay in silence, its grounds neglected, its victims unnamed. Only in recent decades have archaeologists, historians, and memory activists begun to reconstruct its history. Excavations uncovered mass graves, while archival work pieced together train records and testimonies. Slowly, Belzec has emerged from the shadows, but still it is less known than it should be. This documentary serves as a reminder that every camp, no matter how forgotten, holds a central place in the history of humanity's darkest chapter. The purpose of this documentary is not only to recount history, but also to restore Belzec to the place it deserves in memory. Through careful narration, we will reconstruct the story of its creation, its operation, and its victims. We will explore the ideology that drove its existence, the perpetrators who built and ran it, and the survivors who bore witness against all odds. Each chapter will peel back layers of silence, revealing details that have too often been overlooked. We will not simply list facts, but bring them alive through immersive storytelling, so that listeners feel the weight of each moment. Our narrative will give voice to the voiceless, remembering lives otherwise erased. By doing so, we honor not only history, but also the human spirit that resisted annihilation by refusing to be forgotten. To remember Belzec is to strike back against oblivion. This is the story of a camp designed to vanish, yet remembered still. Belzec was built to kill, and then to disappear, to erase its victims, both physically and historically. But memory has survived, fragile though it may be. In telling this story, we give form to the absence, shape to the silence, and presence to the vanished lives. The purpose of this documentary is not only to inform, but to bear witness. As the years pass and survivors fade, the responsibility falls to history and storytelling to keep truth alive. Belzec challenges us. How do we remember what was meant to be forgotten? How do we honor the dead when so little remains of them? By speaking, by narrating, by refusing silence, we ensure Belzec is no longer just a forgotten camp, but an eternal warning. This is where our journey begins. The road to Belzec, and indeed to the entire system of extermination, began long before the camp's construction. From the moment Adolf Hitler rose to power in 1933, Jews in Germany were subjected to a steady campaign of marginalization. Laws stripped them of rights, businesses were boycotted, and professional opportunities closed. The Nazis framed these measures not as temporary restrictions, but as part of a broader vision of racial purification. Schools, workplaces, and public spaces were systematically cleansed of Jewish presence. Each step seemed incremental, but together they formed an escalating march toward exclusion. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 codified this discrimination, redefining Jews as subjects without citizenship. This legal transformation legitimized hatred and made violence appear sanctioned by the state. What began as political rhetoric hardened into law and became the foundation of later annihilation. By the late 1930s, Jewish life in Germany was already suffocated under Nazi rule. The ideological roots of extermination lay in Nazi racial theory, which depicted Jews not simply as an unwanted minority, but as existential enemies. Hitler and his followers propagated the myth of the Jew as a parasite, corrupting nations from within. This language turned neighbors into dangers and coexistence into impossibility. The Nazis fused pseudoscience, distorted anthropology, and centuries of anti-Semitic stereotypes into a coherent doctrine of racial war. They portrayed Germany as locked in a struggle for survival against Jewish influence, a conflict that only one side could win. This framing justified escalating repression, moving the state from discrimination to forced expulsion, and finally to extermination. The rhetoric of purity and cleansing cloaked policies in terms of necessity, making destruction seem like national salvation. Thus, ideology prepared the psychological ground, teaching Germans to view Jews not as individuals, but as threats to be removed. The intellectual poison made mass killing conceivable. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, these ideas took violent form on an unprecedented scale. The conquest of Poland brought millions of Jews under Nazi control, far beyond the population of Germany itself. With this sudden demographic shift, old strategies of marginalization proved insufficient. Instead, the regime created ghettos, walled-off districts where Jewish communities were confined under horrific conditions. Ghettos in Warsaw, Łódź, Lublin, and countless smaller towns became holding pens, designed not for survival, but for gradual destruction through starvation and disease. Families were torn from their homes, businesses seized, and cultural life crushed. Food rations were so minimal that slow death became a daily reality. Police patrols, roundups, and arbitrary violence created a climate of perpetual fear. The ghettos became both prisons and laboratories of suffering. For the Nazis, this was still only a transitional stage, a prelude to something even more catastrophic. The ghettos also served as sites of deception and control. Jews were told they were being resettled temporarily, or that cooperation might ensure survival. Councils known as Judenrat were established, forcing Jewish leaders to administer orders that doomed their own communities. These councils organized labor, distributed meager food supplies, and compiled lists for deportations, often under unbearable duress. German authorities framed this as self-administration, but in truth it was another layer of cruelty. While many council members sought to mitigate suffering, they were powerless against Nazi orders. Meanwhile, overcrowding spread epidemics, and hunger drove people to desperate acts of survival. Children smuggled food across walls, families bartered possessions for scraps, and entire communities struggled to endure day by day. The ghettos were death by attrition, slowly crushing hope until extermination camps emerged as the final step. Belzec would later receive many of its victims directly from these ghettos. The progression from exclusion to extermination was not an abrupt leap, but a calculated evolution. In 1938, during Kristallnacht, violence spilled into the open with shattered synagogues, looted businesses, and arrests of thousands of Jews. This pogrom revealed the state's willingness to turn rhetoric into public brutality. After the invasion of Poland, the occupation authorities tested policies of segregation and mass shootings. Einsatzgruppen mobile killing units followed the Wehrmacht into conquered lands, murdering Jewish men, women, and children in forests and fields. These massacres demonstrated both the feasibility and the psychological toll of mass killing. Even hardened soldiers found themselves shaken by constant shootings and the SS leadership began searching for more systematic, less direct methods of annihilation. This search led directly to the conception of extermination camps. Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka were the answer to the problem the Nazis had created through conquest and ideology. Between 1940 and 1941, the Nazi state intensified its policies with an eye toward final solutions. Jewish property was confiscated en masse, forced labor became widespread, and deportations reshaped communities. At the same time, experiments in killing escalated. The euthanasia program, known as Aktion T4, targeted disabled Germans deemed life unworthy of life. In secret facilities, gas chambers were tested on psychiatric patients and the disabled. These techniques, carbon monoxide poisoning, deception with fake showers, rapid disposal of bodies, became the technical blueprint for extermination camps. SS officers who gained experience in Aktion T4 were later transferred to Operation Reinhard. In this way, a chain of continuity linked domestic programs of murder to the mass extermination of Jews. By 1941, the state had already normalized killing as policy. The step toward Belzec was not sudden, but a deliberate extension of practices tested on the vulnerable. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 marked a decisive turn toward genocidal violence. With Operation Barbarossa, Nazi ideology of racial war was unleashed without restraint. Einsatzgruppen carried out mass shootings of Jews, communists, and others, often with the help of local collaborators. Villages were emptied, and entire communities executed in pits and ravines. The numbers soared into the hundreds of thousands within months. These killings were not hidden but conducted in plain sight, signaling a terrifying escalation. Yet even as bodies piled high, the leadership recognized the logistical strain of mass shootings. Ammunition, manpower, and psychological endurance were stretched thin. It was in this context that the idea of extermination camps gained urgency. Camps like Belzec offered an alternative, centralized, mechanized killing, shielded from public view. Barbarossa thus created both the momentum and the necessity for camps of annihilation to emerge. By late 1941, the outlines of the final solution had crystallized. The Wannsee Conference of January 1942 would formalize the extermination program, but the decision had already taken shape months earlier. Jews were no longer to be confined indefinitely, they were to be eliminated. Deportations from ghettos to killing centers began, with Belzec as one of the first destinations. Racial ideology, years of anti-Jewish laws, the brutal experience of ghettos, and the massacres in the East converged into a single policy of extermination. Belzec became the first camp to put this policy into fully operational practice. Its establishment marked the transition from scattered killings to an industrial program of genocide. In this sense, Belzec was not an isolated project, but the culmination of years of escalation. The road to extermination was paved step by step, each cruelty building upon the last, until annihilation appeared to the Nazis as both logical and inevitable. Operation Reinhard was the code name for the most secret and most deadly phase of the Holocaust, devised in 1941 and 1942. It represented the systematic transition from scattered mass shootings to centralized extermination in purpose-built death camps. The name honored Reinhard Heydrich, one of the principal architects of the final solution, assassinated in Prague in May 1942. Its primary objective was nothing less than the annihilation of the Jews of the general government in occupied Poland. The numbers were staggering. Approximately 2 million people were targeted for immediate destruction. Unlike concentration camps, which combined imprisonment and forced labor, Reinhard camps were built solely to kill. This level of clarity and focus represented the most chilling refinement of Nazi genocide. The plan was designed to be rapid, efficient, and largely hidden from the outside world. Camps were to be located in isolated areas, connected by rail, and staffed with men hardened by earlier killing operations. Belzec was chosen as the first laboratory of mass extermination under this blueprint. The planning of Operation Reinhard began in earnest following the German invasion of the Soviet Union. The Einsatzgruppen shootings had killed hundreds of thousands, but they were proving too slow and too costly in psychological toll for the perpetrators. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, understood that a mechanized solution was needed to annihilate Jews on an unprecedented scale. To implement this, he turned to Odilo Globoknik, SS and police leader of the Lublin district in occupied Poland. Globoknik was ruthless, ambitious, and fully trusted by Himmler to carry out policies of extermination. He was tasked with creating the infrastructure, securing the sites, and overseeing the recruitment of personnel. Operation Reinhard required a chain of command loyal to secrecy and hardened to cruelty. Planning meetings focused not on whether mass killing should occur, but how it could be made systematic and sustainable. Globoknik would make Lublin the administrative hub of genocide, with Belzec as its first operational test ground. Belzec was chosen for several practical reasons that reveal the cold, bureaucratic logic of genocide. The site was remote enough to conceal activities, yet close enough to Jewish population centers for efficient deportation. It lay along a railway line, allowing direct transport of victims from ghettos in Lublin, Lwów, Kraków, and surrounding regions. The area had already seen brutal anti-Jewish actions, making it a landscape primed for escalation. Another advantage was the existing availability of forced laborers, who could construct the camp under SS supervision. Belzec's size was modest compared to later camps, but this was intentional. It was a prototype, designed to refine methods before expanding. Its compact layout meant that killing and disposal could be tightly controlled. The camp's relative obscurity helped maintain secrecy from the wider world. Victims sent there would vanish, swallowed in silence. Thus, Belzec was both a physical location and a chilling experiment in industrialized murder. At the heart of the operation was Christian Wirth, appointed as the first commandant of Belzec. Wirth was not a career soldier, but a police officer and key figure in the Action T4 euthanasia program. In the killing centers of Brandenburg and Hartheim, he had overseen gassings of disabled Germans using carbon monoxide. His experience in deception, efficiency, and disposal of bodies made him indispensable to Reinhard. Wirth embodied the merging of medicalized killing with industrial methods. At Belzec, he introduced techniques such as camouflage, false showers, and the swift separation of victims upon arrival. He was known among his men for brutality, but also for relentless discipline and insistence on secrecy. Himmler trusted him because he had already proven capable of turning ideology into process. Wirth's transfer to Belzec symbolized the direct continuation of Action T4 methods into the Holocaust. Under his direction, Belzec became a prototype for the machinery of extermination. Operation Reinhard was built on three pillars: deception, efficiency, and secrecy. Victims were told they were being resettled to the East for labor, a lie reinforced by forged documents and staged facilities. Efficiency was ensured through streamlined arrival, undressing, gassing, and burial in mass graves. The process was designed to take only hours from the moment a transport arrived to the time bodies were disposed of. Secrecy was enforced with barbed wire, guards, and death threats against locals who might speak. The SS used a small cadre of German personnel, supported by auxiliary guards recruited largely from Soviet POWs. These Trawniki men, as they became known, provided the manpower to control thousands of victims with relative ease. The chain of command was short, the routines were rehearsed, and improvements were constantly introduced. Unlike concentration camps, where survival was possible, Reinhard camps offered no reprieve. Their sole purpose was death, and Belzec demonstrated this ruthlessly. Heinrich Himmler played a central role in shaping the objectives and overseeing their execution. He envisioned Operation Reinhard not only as genocide, but as a logistical masterpiece of Nazi organization. In his view, it combined ideological cleansing with economic exploitation. Jews would be killed, but their possessions, clothes, valuables, even hair and gold teeth would be harvested. The operation required warehouses, accountants, and transport networks, turning mass murder into a state-managed enterprise. Himmler demanded regular reports on numbers killed, efficiency rates, and disposal methods. He inspected sites personally, including Belzec, to ensure that procedures were followed. His presence instilled fear, but also gave legitimacy to the mission. Himmler did not merely sanction genocide. He micromanaged it, treating extermination as a bureaucratic obligation. This combination of ideological conviction and administrative precision made Operation Reinhard terrifyingly effective. Global-Koenig and Wirth formed a deadly partnership in carrying out Himmler's vision. Global-Koenig handled the larger organization, funding, construction orders, coordination with the Reich bureaucracy. Wirth managed the ground-level operations, turning concepts into realities inside Belzec's barbed wire. Together they refined the model of extermination with chilling pragmatism. Early gassing methods using carbon monoxide engines were tested, adjusted, and systematized. Cremation pits were devised to replace overfilled mass graves. Victims were moved through stages: arrival, deception, killing, and disposal, in processes refined for speed and silence. Each new innovation would later be transferred to Sobibor and Treblinka. Operation Reinhard was thus not static but experimental, with Belzec as the testing ground. By late 1942, it had become the model for the final solution at its most efficient. Global-Koenig and Wirth were the engineers of death, driven by both ideology and ruthless ambition. The blueprint created at Belzec became the template for the machinery of mass extermination across Poland. Sobibor and Treblinka, constructed shortly after, copied its layout and methods while expanding capacity. The lessons learned: how to deceive victims, how to manage large transports, how to dispose of bodies, were all first applied at Belzec. Operation Reinhard killed approximately 1.7 million Jews, and Belzec alone accounted for nearly 500,000 of those lives. Yet, unlike Auschwitz, it left almost no survivors, erasing its own testimony through near-total destruction of witnesses. This was by design, a final extension of secrecy, meant to silence memory itself. The camp's operational history was short, but its legacy was immense. It demonstrated that extermination could be industrialized, scaled, and hidden. The bureaucrats had found their solution, and Belzec was their cruel proof of concept. Operation Reinhard had begun, and with it, genocide entered its deadliest phase. The construction of Belzec began in November 1941, at a time when Nazi leaders were searching for permanent solutions to the so-called Jewish question. The decision had been made to transition from mass shootings by mobile killing squads to a more contained, mechanized form of extermination. The site was carefully chosen in southeastern Poland, near the small town of Belzec in the Lublin district. Its location offered both isolation and accessibility, sitting along a crucial rail line that linked major ghettos to the camp. This ensured that deportations could be carried out with minimal logistical difficulties. The area was sparsely populated, reducing the risk of unwanted witnesses. German authorities also relied on the surrounding rural poverty, knowing locals would have little power to resist or report on activities. Initial construction was overseen by SS engineers, who worked with German police and forced laborers. The early stages were rudimentary, involving wooden barracks, fencing, and watchtowers. Yet behind these modest beginnings lay the design of mass murder. The choice of location was deliberate and strategic, shaped by Nazi considerations of geography, transport, and secrecy. Eastern Poland, already scarred by ghettos and forced deportations, was a landscape prepared for atrocity. Belzec's proximity to Lublin allowed Odilo Globoknik to oversee its development directly. The nearby railway station at Belzec connected to lines from Lwów, Kraków, and Warsaw, making it easy to funnel victims from across the region. Trains could pull in discreetly, unload their human cargo, and depart quickly without attracting attention. The hilly terrain provided natural concealment for the camp structures. Forests in the vicinity shielded activities from outside eyes and muffled sounds of terror. German planners calculated these details with chilling precision, ensuring maximum efficiency in secrecy. By early 1942, construction was accelerating, supported by Soviet POWs forced into labor under brutal conditions. The site had been transformed into a secure installation ready to conduct its grim purpose. Belzec was divided into two distinct zones, a design that reflected the Nazis' obsession with control and deception. The first zone was the reception area, where transports of Jews would arrive and undergo initial processing. Here stood barracks, undressing rooms, storage huts for confiscated possessions, and holding pens guarded by SS and Trauniki men. Victims were told they were being sent to showers for disinfection, a lie reinforced by signs and staged facilities. The second zone, separated by barbed wire and camouflage screens, was the extermination area. It contained the gas chambers, burial pits, and the machinery of death hidden behind fences and earthworks. A narrow fenced-off passageway known as the Schlauch or tube connected the two zones. Once victims entered this path, there was no possibility of return. This division ensured that new arrivals saw only a facade, never realizing the reality awaiting them just meters away. Belzec's layout was as much psychological manipulation as physical structure. The extermination zone itself was initially modest, yet carefully constructed to serve its lethal function. Early gas chambers were small wooden structures designed to kill several dozen victims at a time, using carbon monoxide from engine exhaust. Burial pits were dug nearby, vast trenches that could hold thousands of bodies. The SS constantly adjusted the design, testing methods of concealment, disposal, and efficiency. As deportations increased, the wooden gas chambers were replaced with more permanent brick and concrete structures. These new chambers could kill hundreds of victims in a single cycle, significantly increasing throughput. Camouflage was applied to buildings, with some painted to resemble bathhouses. Watchtowers surrounded the perimeter, manned by guards ready to fire on any prisoner attempting escape. The extermination zone was deliberately concealed by high fences woven with branches to hide activities from the reception area. This physical design allowed extermination to be carried out swiftly, silently, and almost invisibly. Construction was carried out with shocking brutality, using forced laborers who were themselves destined to die. Soviet prisoners of war, already weakened by starvation and mistreatment, were deployed to build the gas chambers, dig trenches, and erect fences. They labored under the whips of German overseers, denied proper tools or food. Many collapsed from exhaustion and disease, their bodies discarded or executed on the spot. Jewish forced laborers from nearby ghettos were also brought in, compelled to shape the camp that would later consume them. Workers dug foundations, cut timber, and hauled heavy stones, often under freezing winter conditions. The SS maintained discipline through public beatings and random shootings, ensuring fear replaced any thought of resistance. Once construction tasks were completed, these laborers were systematically killed to eliminate witnesses. New groups were then brought in, continuing the deadly cycle. In this way, Belzec was not only a place of death, but a place built upon death. The logistics of construction posed challenges that revealed both the improvisation and determination of the Nazi system. Rail connections had to be modified to allow trains to stop discreetly near the camp. Supplies of building materials were limited, requiring requisition from local depots and forced seizure from Polish villages. Winter conditions in late 1941 slowed progress, with frost and snow making excavation of pits nearly impossible. SS supervisors, however, demanded speed, threatening laborers with immediate execution if quotas were not met. Fuel for the gas chambers had to be tested, leading to experiments with different engines and exhaust systems. Camouflage methods were debated, with fences woven from branches to disguise the true nature of the site. Despite setbacks, the combination of forced labor, brutality, and SS oversight ensured that construction advanced rapidly. By March 1942, the camp was functional, though constant modifications would continue throughout its operation. Every logistical hurdle became an opportunity to refine extermination techniques. The camp's construction thus embodied both cruelty and ruthless adaptation. The dual-zone layout of Belzec was not accidental, but rather the result of lessons learned from earlier killing operations. Aktion T4 euthanasia centers had taught men like Christian Worth that victims must be deceived to prevent panic. At Belzec, this principle was applied on a far larger scale. The reception zone created the illusion of order and routine, while the extermination zone carried out the hidden reality. The tube connecting the two was a psychological weapon, narrowing into a path that stripped victims of any final hope. SS officers described it as a cattle chute, designed to herd people efficiently into death. This design minimized the need for violent herding and reduced the risk of disruption. The structure of Belzec became a model for Sobibor and Treblinka, its innovations replicated and expanded. Each element, from fences to chambers, was the product of experimentation in mass killing. The camp's architecture was thus a blueprint for genocide. By the spring of 1942, Belzec stood as the first fully operational death camp of Operation Reinhard. Though modest in size, its design embodied the Nazi ideal of extermination as an industrial process. Every element, from train tracks to fences, was built not for imprisonment, but for annihilation. The camp's remote location masked its function, while its dual-zone layout concealed the killing process from new arrivals. Construction challenges had been overcome through brutality, secrecy, and ruthless innovation. Forced laborers who built the camp were murdered to erase traces of their work. SS leaders inspected the site with satisfaction, seeing in Belzec a working model for future camps. The lessons of its construction would soon shape Sobibor and Treblinka, expanding the machinery of death across occupied Poland. Belzec was no longer an idea on paper, but a functioning extermination site ready to receive its first transports. In its very foundations lay the blueprint of the Holocaust's deadliest phase. In February and March of 1942, Belzec transitioned from construction site to killing center with its first experimental gassings. These initial killings were designed to test the functionality of the camp's machinery of death, rather than to process mass transports immediately. The SS used small groups of Jewish prisoners taken from nearby ghettos to serve as the first victims of these trials. Victims were forced into the primitive wooden gas chambers under the pretense of undergoing disinfection. The chambers were sealed tightly, while exhaust fumes from a captured Soviet tank engine were pumped inside. Guards observed the process with clinical detachment, noting how long it took for victims to collapse and die. Some victims suffered for up to 30 minutes, gasping desperately before death claimed them. The SS considered this a failure, believing the process needed refinement to achieve faster results. Afterward, the corpses were buried in hastily dug pits near the camp. The brutality of these experiments marked the beginning of Belzec's role in industrialized killing. The choice of carbon monoxide from engines as the killing method was a direct result of earlier Nazi experiments. During the Aktion T4 euthanasia program, German doctors had already tested the use of gas to murder disabled individuals in Germany. These techniques were now adapted to Belzec, with mobile engines replacing bottled gas. Soviet tank and truck engines, captured during the invasion of the USSR, were deemed powerful enough to produce lethal amounts of carbon monoxide. Mechanics modified the engines to ensure a steady, continuous output of exhaust fumes. Prisoners were packed into chambers measuring only a few meters wide, with little air circulation. The tight confinement made panic and suffocation part of the process, even before the gas took full effect. SS overseers recorded observations about victim behavior, timing, and logistical issues. The killing was not viewed as a crime, but as a technical problem to be solved. This mindset allowed mass murder to be approached with the coldness of engineering. The early wooden chambers, however, proved inadequate for the task the Nazis envisioned. Their small size limited the number of victims who could be killed in each cycle. Poor construction led to leaks, forcing guards to reinforce doors and cracks with tar and nails. The engines themselves often stalled, producing inconsistent levels of gas. As a result, deaths were slow and agonizing, leaving victims to struggle for air, while guards waited impatiently outside. Christian Worth, the camp's first commandant, insisted that improvements were necessary if Belzec was to fulfill its purpose. Plans were made to replace wooden chambers with more permanent structures of brick and concrete. These new chambers would allow for hundreds of victims to be murdered at once, increasing efficiency. By spring 1942, work began on expanding the extermination facilities in direct response to the lessons of these trials. Belzec was evolving into a factory of death, engineered for speed and concealment. The first mass transports began arriving in March 1942, testing the new extermination procedures on a larger scale. Trains carried Jews from Lublin, Lvov, and surrounding ghettos, each car packed with men, women, and children. Upon arrival, victims were forced out of cattle cars by shouting guards and barking dogs. They were told to leave their belongings behind, which were collected for the Reich's benefit. Deception was crucial, with victims instructed that they were being sent for showers and medical inspections. Men and women were separated, undressed, and herded into the tube, the narrow fenced path leading to the gas chambers. Panic sometimes spread as people sensed the danger, but brutal beatings and whips forced them forward. Once inside, the heavy doors were sealed, and the engines roared to life. Within minutes to half an hour, silence fell over the chamber. For the first time, Belzec operated at full capacity as a death factory. The aftermath of these first killings revealed both logistical challenges and horrific realities. Corpses piled up quickly, overwhelming the burial pits that had been dug by forced laborers. Workers, often Jews themselves, were forced to drag bodies out of the chambers with hooks and ropes. They stacked them in rows before tossing them into mass graves. Many bodies bore signs of violent struggle, with scratches on doors and bloody hands, showing their desperate attempts to escape. The stench of death spread across the camp, carried by wind to nearby villages. Locals reported strange smells and smoke, though many dared not ask questions. The SS soon realized that burial alone was unsustainable, as decomposing bodies caused ground swelling and foul odors. This would later lead to exhumations and mass cremations, but in early 1942, bodies were simply dumped and covered with earth. The sheer scale of death was already overwhelming Belzec's infrastructure. For nearby communities, the first killings did not go entirely unnoticed. Farmers and villagers near Belzec observed trains arriving full and departing empty. Strange noises, screams, and the constant barking of dogs drifted beyond the barbed wire. The thick smoke from burning possessions mixed with the odors of decomposition seeping into the countryside. While most locals remained silent out of fear, whispers circulated in nearby towns and villages. Some Poles attempted to warn Jews still outside the camp, though many were too powerless to intervene. German authorities enforced strict secrecy, threatening death to anyone who spread rumors. Guards patrolled not just the camp but the surrounding area, intimidating witnesses into silence. Despite this, knowledge of Belzec's purpose began to spread slowly among occupied populations. The killings were impossible to hide completely, no matter how carefully the SS tried. Within the SS, the first months of Belzec's operation were considered a grim success. Reports were sent to Berlin detailing the number of victims murdered and the efficiency of procedures. Himmler himself received updates, satisfied that Operation Reinhard was progressing as planned. Odilo Globoknik boasted that Belzec was proving the feasibility of industrial extermination. Christian Wirth and his staff were praised for their brutality and innovation in refining the killing process. To them, the suffering of victims was irrelevant, only speed and numbers mattered. The camp had demonstrated that mass gassing was possible on an unprecedented scale. Lessons learned here would be transferred directly to Sobibor and Treblinka. Belzec had thus become a laboratory for genocide, a place where killing was systematized through trial and error. Each trainload of victims served as another test in perfecting mass murder. By the summer of 1942, Belzec had completed its grim transition from experimental site to fully functioning extermination camp. The first killings, once viewed as tests, had become routine operations. The camp staff grew more practiced, reducing the time between transports and killings. Victims were processed with assembly line precision, their deaths carried out in near total silence from the outside world. The wooden chambers gave way to more permanent structures, capable of handling thousands per day. The efficiency of Belzec shocked even its operators, who now recognized the vast potential of systematic extermination. What began as experimental gassings had become a daily slaughter of unimaginable scale. The camp's design, secrecy, and process were now a template for Nazi genocide. In less than a year, Belzec would claim the lives of hundreds of thousands. The first killings had set into motion a machine of death that would not stop until the camp itself was dismantled. The transformation of Belzec into a killing center coincided with the initiation of mass deportations from the ghettos of occupied Poland. In March 1942, transports began arriving from Lublin, marking the first large-scale application of Operation Reinhard's extermination program. Entire Jewish communities were uprooted from their homes with brutal efficiency, herded into trains bound for Belzec. German orders were delivered to Judenräte, who were forced to provide lists of names under the illusion of resettlement. Families packed their belongings, often believing they were being moved to labor camps in the east. Instead, they were marched under guard to railway stations, where cattle cars waited. The efficiency of these deportations relied on the active participation of German police, local collaborators, and railway officials. Once loaded into the trains, the victims disappeared into a system designed for their destruction. Lublin was only the beginning, as deportations from Lwów, Kraków, and dozens of smaller towns soon followed. The machinery of genocide was now operating at full scale. The train journeys themselves became part of the torment that defined deportation. Victims were crammed into cattle cars, often 100 people to a car designed for 20 livestock. Windows were barred, doors sealed, and ventilation was minimal, creating suffocating conditions inside. During summer transports, heat built up to unbearable levels, while in winter, freezing temperatures condemned many to death before arrival. Water was denied, food was non-existent, and the bucket provided as a latrine quickly overflowed. Screams, prayers, and cries of children filled the air, punctuated by the blows of guards if noise grew too loud. Some deportees suffocated en route, their corpses left standing among the living. For those who survived the journey, exhaustion and thirst left them in a state of collapse upon arrival. The cattle car journey became the first stage of extermination, weakening victims before they even reached the camp. The train symbolized the cruel intersection of modern logistics with medieval barbarity. The German Reichsbahn, the state railway system, played a central role in the deportation process. Every transport required meticulous scheduling, with trains carrying Jews to Belzec running alongside freight and military traffic. The Reichsbahn charged fares for each deportee, billing Jewish communities or confiscated Jewish assets to cover costs. Conductors and railway officials executed their duties with bureaucratic detachment, rarely questioning the human cargo. Tickets were not issued to individuals, but waybills treated prisoners as freight to be delivered. Special timetables ensured that deportation trains did not interfere with military operations. Engineers, station masters, and administrators all participated, making extermination logistically possible on such a scale. These men were not merely passive functionaries. Their cooperation ensured that the killing program ran on schedule. Without the Reichsbahn, the scale of the Holocaust would not have been achievable. The railway became as much a tool of mass murder as the gas chambers themselves. Deportations from Lwów, one of the largest Jewish centers in eastern Poland, revealed the cruelty of systematic roundups. German authorities and Ukrainian auxiliaries surrounded ghettos at dawn, driving thousands into the streets. Families were given minutes to gather belongings before being forced toward railway stations. Elderly people who could not keep up were shot on the spot, their bodies left behind as warnings. Children were beaten to silence their cries, while mothers carried them under the weight of sacks and bundles. The march to the station was itself an ordeal, with columns of Jews stretching for miles. Once at the trains, the illusion of resettlement ended, as guards whipped and shoved deportees into cattle cars. Any who resisted were executed in full view of others. The Lwów transport sent tens of thousands to Belzec in the spring and summer of 1942. Few who boarded those trains ever returned. Kraków, another major city with a long Jewish history, saw its population systematically stripped away. In March and June of 1942, entire ghettos were liquidated in coordinated operations. German soldiers, Gestapo officers, and local police worked together to drive thousands into waiting transports. Jews were told they were being moved for labor, but the destination remained shrouded in secrecy. The Reichsbahn timetables made no mention of Belzec, only listing junctions and times. As trains pulled away, the ghetto grew silent, its once bustling streets now filled with abandoned belongings. Eyewitnesses described the eerie sound of doors slamming on cattle cars, each one sealing the fate of dozens of families. Some Jews tried to bribe officials to be left behind, but very few succeeded. The deportations drained Krakow's Jewish life, with entire neighborhoods left desolate. Belzec absorbed these human beings into its killing machine with relentless speed. Smaller towns and villages across the Lublin and Lvov districts fed Belzec with a constant stream of victims. Trains arrived daily, sometimes more than once, each one carrying hundreds bound for death. Jews from Tarnów, Razisuv, and Zamość were among those deported, uprooted from centuries-old communities. Local railway stations became scenes of terror as villagers watched their Jewish neighbors herded away. The scale of the deportations soon overwhelmed the camp, forcing adjustments in burial pits and killing procedures. Each transport was recorded in German files, reducing human beings to numbers on a page. The efficiency of the process belied the horror it unleashed upon entire populations. Communities that had existed for generations vanished in a matter of days or weeks. Survivors left behind, often in hiding, described the emptiness that followed. Belzec became the silent graveyard for the vanished shtetls of eastern Poland. Coordination between Nazi agencies ensured that deportations occurred with ruthless precision. The SS, Gestapo, German civil authorities, and Reichsbahn worked hand in glove to orchestrate the destruction of Jewish life. Orders traveled from Berlin to district governors, who in turn instructed local police to carry out roundups. Trains were requisitioned days in advance, scheduled with military-like discipline. At each station, SS officers supervised the loading process, ensuring maximum efficiency. Deportees were counted, crammed into cars, and dispatched under sealed orders. Even the belongings of deportees were catalogued, stripped, and sent to warehouses in the Reich. Nothing was left to chance. The machinery of extermination required cooperation across every level of government. This collaboration blurred the line between civilian administration and military operations. Mass deportations revealed how genocide could be disguised as administrative procedure. The beginning of deportations to Belzec in 1942 marked a watershed moment in the Holocaust. It was the first time that Jews were removed from their homes on such a massive scale for immediate extermination. Unlike labor camps, Belzec offered no selection or reprieve. Arrival meant near certain death. The trains symbolized the complete severing of victims from their families, homes, and communities. At every stage, from the ghetto to the station to the camp, victims endured humiliation, brutality, and despair. For the perpetrators, the process became routine, an efficient system running like clockwork. For the victims, it was the final journey into oblivion, the end of centuries of Jewish life in Poland. The deportations revealed the fusion of modern technology with medieval cruelty. The railway became both the path and the weapon of genocide. With each transport, Belzec moved closer to its role as the graveyard of 500,000 souls. When the train screeched to a halt at the Belzec station siding, the prisoners inside were already weakened by days of suffocation and starvation. SS guards, often aided by Ukrainian auxiliaries, flung open the sliding doors of the cattle cars. Blinding sunlight and barking dogs met the eyes of those who stumbled out into the open. Corpses of those who had perished en route were dragged out and piled to the side, a grim first sight for the newly arrived. Prisoners were ordered to line up quickly, their confusion and exhaustion exploited by the brutality of the guards. Officers shouted instructions that carried an air of false authority, giving victims the impression of order. Many clutched their bundles of clothing or food, believing resettlement still awaited them. The camp was deliberately designed to look temporary and functional, masking its true purpose. For the victims, this was the first step into a carefully orchestrated deception. For the SS, it was the beginning of the final act in a tightly rehearsed process of mass murder. Deception played a central role in controlling the chaos of arrival. Signs posted around the camp, indicated showers or baths, suggesting a sanitary procedure rather than extermination. Prisoners were told by interpreters that they would undergo disinfection before moving on to labor camps. This reassurance momentarily calmed many, preventing resistance or panic. Some guards even used a falsely polite tone, instructing families to stay together and keep their belongings neat. The illusion of normality created a false sense of hope in the midst of fear. Victims were further deceived by the camp's architecture, which included fences disguised with tree branches. The calculated deception ensured that the thousands arriving daily could be herded efficiently. Resistance, confusion, or revolt would have complicated the process, so lies became as essential as weapons. By manipulating trust, the perpetrators guaranteed that victims marched willingly toward death. Separation was the next stage of the process, executed with ruthless precision. Men were directed to one side, women and children to the other, under the pretext of organization. Families were torn apart within seconds, fathers reaching out for children they would never see again. Mothers clutched infants while trying to reassure older children, only to be shoved into separate lines. Guards moved quickly, preventing prolonged goodbyes or emotional scenes that might incite panic. The division was absolute, with no exceptions granted once lines were drawn. For the men, this often meant a direct path towards stripping and forced marches. For women and children, the same fate awaited, but with added terror in watching their protectors vanish. Survivors who later testified remembered this moment as the most heartbreaking of all. The calculated cruelty of separation destroyed the final bonds of family at the threshold of death. Once divided, prisoners were stripped of all possessions in a systematic robbery disguised as procedure. They were ordered to deposit suitcases, jewelry, and money in designated collection areas, under the promise that items would be returned. Women were instructed to remove valuables, even wedding rings, with guards threatening punishment for concealment. Belongings were sorted immediately by prisoner laborers, packed into storerooms, and later shipped to the Reich. Clothes were stacked in neat piles, creating the illusion of temporary storage. Even shoes were collected, later used in German war industries or sold for profit. In these moments, human dignity was reduced to a ledger entry, with lives translated into material value. The SS called this property administration, but for the victims it was the theft of their entire existence. As they stood stripped of belongings, they became not just vulnerable, but entirely dehumanized. The theft reinforced the illusion of resettlement, while accelerating the efficiency of murder. The forced undressing that followed deepened humiliation and despair. Men were ordered to strip naked in open yards, often beaten if they hesitated or resisted. Women were driven into separate areas, where they too were forced to undress under the eyes of guards. Children, crying in confusion, clung to their mothers as clothing was pulled away. Hair was often shaved, particularly from women, who were mocked and jeered during the process. This was done not only for supposed sanitation, but also to harvest hair for industrial purposes. Naked and vulnerable, prisoners stood in lines with no protection from the gaze or abuse of guards. Their vulnerability was a deliberate psychological weapon, crushing dignity and resistance. The act of stripping erased individuality, transforming people into anonymous bodies to be processed. For the perpetrators, it was the final step before sending victims to their deaths. From the undressing yards, victims were driven toward the so-called tube, a fenced path leading directly to the gas chambers. The path was camouflaged with branches and fences, designed to prevent escape and to obscure its true purpose. Guards shouted orders, herding the naked prisoners forward with whips, rifle butts, and dogs. Some prisoners, realizing too late what awaited, screamed or prayed, but their voices were drowned in the chaos. Others walked in stunned silence, already broken by exhaustion and fear. Children cried as mothers tried to soothe them, even as they marched toward death. The tube symbolized the last stage of deception, a corridor between false reassurance and annihilation. For the SS, efficiency depended on momentum, ensuring that lines of victims never slowed. The entire process was timed, so that one transport could be murdered while the next arrived. The march down the tube was the irreversible descent into oblivion. Inside the camp, every element of arrival was designed to mask death as procedure. The guards used calm words mixed with brutality, offering a confusing blend of reassurance and terror. Prisoners were told they would bathe, their clothes disinfected, and afterward they would rejoin their families. Signs bearing words like showers and delousing reinforced the illusion. Even the architecture of the gas chamber buildings resembled bathhouses from the outside. Victims, exhausted and broken, clung to the faint hope that the ordeal was temporary. The psychological manipulation ensured minimal resistance, reducing the need for force. Those who suspected the truth were quickly silenced, beaten, or killed on the spot. Deception and speed were the twin pillars of the arrival process, ensuring the machinery of death remained uninterrupted. The system was perfected until it ran with the cold efficiency of an assembly line. The arrival process at Belzec encapsulated the Nazi strategy of extermination cloaked in deception. From the moment victims stepped off the train to the forced march into the gas chambers, every step was engineered to strip them of hope, dignity, and resistance. Guards blended brutality with false reassurances, creating a psychological fog that paralyzed the prisoners. Families were destroyed in seconds through forced separations that tore away their last source of comfort. Possessions were confiscated, bodies stripped, and individuality erased under the guise of procedure. Naked and broken, the victims marched down the tube believing they might emerge cleansed or reassigned. In truth, the process was designed to deliver them seamlessly into death. By hiding the reality until the final moment, the SS avoided chaos and maintained mass killing efficiency. Belzec's arrival process became a template replicated in other extermination camps under Operation Reinhard. It was here that genocide assumed the appearance of order, even as it unleashed unimaginable destruction. The gas chambers at Belzec represented the transition from improvised killings to an industrialized system of mass murder. Constructed to resemble ordinary bathhouses, their outward appearance was part of the deception that kept victims compliant until the last moment. Initially, the camp operated with 3 small gas chambers built of wood, each capable of killing several hundred people at once. By mid-1942, these were replaced with a larger brick building containing 6 chambers, dramatically increasing capacity. The chambers were windowless, sealed rooms with tightly fitting doors to prevent escape or leakage. Victims, already stripped of their clothes and dignity, were driven inside under the pretense of bathing. The interior contained fake showerheads, reinforcing the illusion of disinfection. Once the doors were shut, silence fell outside, punctuated only by the growls of engines that powered the killing method. The chambers became the heart of Belzec's operation, turning deception into death within minutes. In their design and function, they revealed the cold rationality of genocide disguised as procedure. The killing method at Belzec relied on carbon monoxide gas generated by large internal combustion engines, unlike later extermination camps that experimented with Zyklon B. Belzec remained consistent with engine exhaust as its primary method of asphyxiation. The engines were usually tank or truck motors repurposed for the task, positioned outside the chamber buildings. Long pipes connected the exhaust to the sealed rooms, filling them with poisonous fumes once started. As the gas replaced oxygen, victims suffocated within 15 to 30 minutes, depending on the chamber's load. Children and the elderly often succumbed faster, while stronger adults fought for breath until collapsing. The noise of engines masked the cries from inside, though some witnesses still recalled muffled screams. When the engines cut off, silence signaled that the operation was complete. This mechanical process reduced murder to a routine, repeated multiple times each day. The method was chosen for its efficiency, simplicity, and ability to kill en masse without requiring direct human violence. Capacity was central to Belzec's efficiency as a death camp. The first set of wooden chambers could kill approximately 500 to 800 people per session, already staggering in scale. But the expansion to 6 brick-built chambers in mid-1942 raised capacity to 1,500 or even 2,000 victims per cycle. With multiple cycles carried out daily, the camp could exterminate several thousand people in a single day. These numbers reflected not only logistical planning, but also the deliberate acceleration of the Holocaust under Operation Reinhard. The design allowed for continuous flow. As one group was dying, the next transport was already being processed through the arrival yards. Chamber capacity determined the rhythm of murder, syncing with the train schedules of the Reichsbahn. This efficiency was critical to the goal of annihilating Jewish communities in Poland within months. The staggering speed of death at Belzec shocked even some SS overseers. Yet for the planners, numbers mattered more than human lives, and capacity became the measure of success. SS men oversaw the operation of the gas chambers with cold detachment, delegating much of the direct labor to Ukrainian guards. Christian Worth, the camp's first commandant, insisted on strict discipline and secrecy in handling the killing process. German SS personnel were responsible for starting engines, timing the gassing, and supervising the removal of bodies. Ukrainian auxiliaries, often recruited from Soviet POWs, performed the brutal tasks of herding victims into chambers. They used rifle butts, whips, and dogs to drive terrified prisoners through the doors before slamming them shut. Once the victims were sealed inside, SS men activated the engines and monitored the process until all noise ceased. Their efficiency reflected training, indoctrination, and the complete erasure of empathy. The collaboration between SS leadership and Ukrainian guards ensured that the killing system functioned like clockwork. Survivors who later testified spoke of the cold, mechanical demeanor of the perpetrators. For the SS, this was not murder in passion but death as administration. The removal of bodies after each gassing was another stage in the process, handled by Jewish prisoners forced into Sonderkommando units. Once the engine stopped, guards opened the chamber doors to reveal piles of tangled corpses. The bodies were often discolored from suffocation, with foam at the mouths and blood from noses. Sonderkommando prisoners dragged the corpses out, stripped them of hidden valuables, and arranged them for burial or later cremation. Gold teeth were pried out by camp dentists, further stripping dignity from the dead. These tasks were performed under the constant threat of execution if prisoners slowed or resisted. The chambers were quickly cleaned to prepare for the next transport, leaving no pause in the cycle of killing. The SS ensured that death left no trace that could disrupt the illusion for the next group of arrivals. This grisly routine turned mass murder into a production line. The system was designed to be self-sustaining until human resources were exhausted. Efficiency became the hallmark of Belzec's gas chambers, as extermination was carried out with chilling regularity. Transports of thousands arrived daily, each group processed in a matter of hours. The deception during arrival reduced resistance, allowing guards to maintain order without massive force. Chamber size ensured that large groups could be killed simultaneously, saving time and fuel. Carbon monoxide engines required little specialized maintenance, ensuring reliability in the killing process. Victims were murdered swiftly enough that new transports could immediately replace them in the cycle. Each step, arrival, undressing, gassing, and body removal, was timed to create uninterrupted flow. In this sense, Belzec represented the refinement of genocide into a logistical operation. The chambers themselves were tools of bureaucracy, their function no different than machinery in a factory. Except here the output was death, measured in the obliteration of entire communities. Witnesses later described the sensory details of the gas chambers with haunting clarity. The overwhelming stench of bodies and engine exhaust lingered across the camp, impossible to mask. Prisoners forced into labor recalled the sight of chambers opening to reveal a mountain of lifeless forms. The heat, combined with decomposition, made conditions unbearable for those compelled to clean up. Guards often smoked or joked, while overseeing this work, displaying grotesque indifference to the horrors before them. Survivors emphasized the contrast between human suffering and mechanical routine. The fake showerheads inside the chambers symbolized the ultimate betrayal, tricking victims into believing they were safe. Every detail, from the camouflaged path to the sealed doors, was part of an engineered illusion. The gas chambers were not simply killing rooms, they were carefully constructed theaters of deception. The sensory memory of these chambers became the most lasting evidence of their existence. The gas chambers of Belzec embodied the most ruthless efficiency of Operation Reinhard. They were built to erase human lives with speed, secrecy, and industrial precision. Unlike earlier mass shootings, which relied on bullets and left visible trauma for perpetrators, the chambers detached killers from their victims. Murder was mechanized, hidden behind sealed doors and the hum of engines. This detachment made extermination scalable, allowing 500,000 people to be killed within months. The chambers also established a model that was replicated and expanded at Sobibor and Treblinka. Belzec's role as the first fully operational death camp marked a turning point in the Holocaust's evolution. The SS men and guards who ran it perfected genocide into a system rather than a series of acts. The gas chambers became both the physical and symbolic core of Belzec's purpose. In their walls, the ideology of extermination found its most devastating expression. The victims of Belzec came primarily from the Jewish communities of Galicia, Kraków, Lublin, and surrounding Polish regions. These communities had thrived for centuries, rich in culture, religion, and family life. But they were targeted for total destruction. Entire ghettos were emptied in carefully orchestrated deportations, with trains rolling directly into the camp's reception area. Families who once filled synagogues and marketplaces with vibrancy were herded into cattle cars without food, water, or hope. Many had already endured ghettoization, starvation, and humiliation before their final journey to Belzec. The Germans systematically dismantled their world, reducing thriving towns into ghostly remnants. Survivors later recalled the haunting silence that followed these deportations, with streets left empty and abandoned. Local Poles who witnessed these deportations spoke of entire villages vanishing in a matter of days. For the Nazis, these people were not individuals, but numbers on a timetable, scheduled for erasure. Belzec became the final destination for hundreds of thousands who had once lived ordinary lives. Galicia, with its significant Jewish population, suffered the most devastating losses. Towns such as Tarnów, Rzeszów, and Przemyśl saw their Jewish populations forcibly deported to Belzec in wave after wave of transports. Testimonies describe families crammed into freight cars, suffocating in the heat, or freezing in the cold, depending on the season. Children cried endlessly while the elderly collapsed, unable to withstand the brutal conditions of travel. When the train doors finally opened, many were already dead, their bodies discarded without dignity. Those who survived the journey faced deception, being told they were going for resettlement in the east. In reality, they walked a short distance from the platform to the gas chambers that awaited them. The destruction of Galician Jewry was swift, comprehensive, and largely unrecorded in official histories. Few escaped to tell their stories, making their absence all the more tragic. Belzec, unlike Auschwitz, left almost no survivors to bear witness to these vanished communities. The Jews of Krakow, once a center of Jewish intellectual and cultural life, were also swept into Belzec's killing machinery. The Krakow ghetto, established in 1941, became a holding ground until deportations intensified in 1942. Families were torn from their homes, marched through cobbled streets under guard, and forced into cattle cars at nearby railway stations. Survivors remembered the heartbreak of mothers clutching children, fathers desperately trying to shield loved ones, and elders resigned to fate. Many of Krakow's Jews were among the earliest to be gassed at Belzec, making their destruction a template for other deportations. Entire schools, businesses, and congregations ceased to exist within weeks. The cultural vibrancy of Jewish Krakow, with its synagogues and Yiddish theaters, was extinguished in the gas chambers of Belzec. Testimonies that survive come from those few who escaped deportation by hiding or joining underground movements. For most, however, their journey ended in silence behind barbed wire and sealed doors. Belzec became the graveyard of Krakow's Jewish legacy. Lublin, another historic center of Jewish life, also fed Belzec's furnaces of death. The liquidation of the Lublin ghetto in March 1942 marked one of the earliest major deportations to the camp. Eyewitnesses described how families were rounded up at dawn, herded through the streets, and forced into waiting cattle cars. Children clung to their parents while guards beat the elderly to keep the line moving. The journey to Belzec was short but brutal, with no water and no sanitation for the passengers. Upon arrival, the deception continued, with prisoners told to undress for showers. Within hours, thousands of Lublin Jews were dead, their bodies piled in mass graves. The liquidation of Lublin was a devastating signal of the new extermination phase of the Holocaust. Local witnesses recalled the eerie emptiness of the ghetto afterward, as if an entire people had been erased overnight. Belzec stood as the machine of that erasure, designed for speed and totality. Though Jews were the overwhelming majority of victims, Belzec also claimed the lives of Poles, Romani, and others deemed undesirable by Nazi ideology. Romani families, already persecuted across Europe, were rounded up and sent to Belzec in smaller but significant numbers. Their distinct culture and traditions made them targets of racial hatred, classified as inferior and expendable. Many Polish political prisoners, priests, and intellectuals also found their deaths within Belzec's chambers. These groups, though smaller in number compared to the Jews, were subjected to the same deception and brutality. Testimonies suggest that Romani victims often sang prayers or chants as they were driven to their deaths. The Germans regarded them as subhuman, stripping away centuries of culture and heritage in a matter of minutes. The persecution of Romani at Belzec is less documented but remains a critical element of its legacy. Together with Jews and Poles, they represent the wide net of Nazi extermination policies. Belzec became a place where diversity was extinguished in the name of racist ideology. Personal stories help restore humanity to the faceless statistics of Belzec. Survivors and witnesses recalled names, faces, and voices that history tried to erase. A mother comforting her child on the train, whispering stories to calm fear, embodies the human dimension of loss. A grandfather offering his last piece of bread to his starving grandchildren shows the resilience of family bonds. Diaries recovered from deportees provide haunting insights, describing uncertainty, fear, and the faint hope of survival. One testimony recounted a woman who carried her wedding ring hidden in her clothing until the very end. Another told of children singing lullabies on the platform, unaware of the fate that awaited them. These glimpses of humanity pierce through the enormity of the tragedy. While Nazi bureaucracy reduced victims to numbers, their individual lives carried stories, dreams, and futures. Belzec consumed them, but memory resists their erasure by reclaiming their voices. The destruction wrought by Belzec meant the complete erasure of entire towns and villages. In many cases, no Jewish residents survived to rebuild communities after the war. Streets once filled with laughter and commerce were left silent, their synagogues reduced to ruins or repurposed by locals. In Galicia alone, dozens of towns saw their Jewish populations vanish in transports to Belzec. Villages that had celebrated Passover and Sabbath for centuries no longer had anyone to kindle the traditions. Cemeteries stood untended, with no descendants left to remember the names carved in stone. Survivors who returned after the war found their hometowns empty of Jewish life, the community destroyed not only physically, but spiritually. The Nazis succeeded in obliterating more than lives. They annihilated entire ways of life. Belzec thus symbolizes not just death but cultural annihilation on a massive scale. The vanished towns stand as ghostly reminders of a world lost forever. The victims of Belzec were ordinary men, women, and children caught in the machinery of genocide. Their deaths were not collateral, but the central purpose of the camp's existence. Each transport carried people with histories, families, and identities that were systematically erased. The diversity of victims, Jews, Poles, Romani, and others, shows the wide scope of Nazi racial hatred. Testimonies, scarce as they are, provide fragments of memory to counter the silence. Survivors and historians work to ensure that the names of Belzec's dead are not lost to statistics. The enormity of 500,000 deaths defies comprehension, but individual stories help bridge the gap. Belzec's victims were not anonymous masses but vibrant communities destroyed in secrecy. Their legacy endures in memory, testimony, and the continuing responsibility to remember. In honoring them, history restores humanity stolen by the gas chambers. The machinery of Belzec did not operate by itself. It was driven by men who embraced, tolerated, or ignored the brutality unfolding daily. At the top of this apparatus stood Christian Wirth, the camp's first commandant, and one of the most ruthless figures of Operation Reinhard. Wirth had previously overseen the Nazi euthanasia program, giving him both the technical knowledge and ideological commitment to mass murder. He brought with him a cadre of men experienced in killing, transferring methods from psychiatric hospitals to extermination camps. His insistence on efficiency, discipline, and deception shaped Belzec's deadly system. Under his command, the camp became a model of industrialized death, where human lives were reduced to logistics. Wirth's cruelty was infamous, often demonstrated in random acts of violence against prisoners. He saw the extermination process as a task to be perfected, demanding speed and absolute obedience from his subordinates. The men under him understood that failure was not tolerated, only results. In this way, Wirth personified the calculated savagery that turned Belzec into a prototype of genocide. The SS personnel, who staffed Belzec, were not vast in number, yet their influence was enormous. Typically numbering fewer than 100 Germans, they held absolute authority over the camp and its victims. These men were carefully selected for loyalty to the Nazi cause, and often for prior experience in programs like Action T4. Many were ordinary men who became extraordinary killers, their roles normalized through training and indoctrination. They carried out duties ranging from overseeing deportations to supervising gas chamber operations. Camp commandants, officers and guards worked together in a brutal rhythm of extermination. Some were sadists who relished cruelty, while others simply performed their roles with cold detachment. What united them was their participation in a process that demanded moral numbness and obedience. Bureaucracy shielded them from conscience, turning murder into routine procedure. The SS men at Belzec were both architects and executioners of mass death. Christian Worth's methods became a template for extermination camps. He enforced strict discipline among his men, ensuring the process of killing was carried out with ruthless precision. Victims were deceived at every stage, from arrival to the very moment of death, minimizing resistance and chaos. Worth introduced techniques that maximized efficiency, such as rapid unloading of trains and swift separation of victims. He supervised the construction and improvement of gas chambers, insisting they meet standards for productivity. His obsession with secrecy ensured that Belzec left behind little documentation, a deliberate effort to erase evidence. Worth also cultivated a culture of brutality, where violence against prisoners was not only permitted but encouraged. His personal involvement in beatings and shootings demonstrated to his men that cruelty was acceptable. Subordinates learned to imitate his merciless style, embedding terror into the daily function of the camp. Through him, Belzec became not just a site of killing, but an experiment in organized extermination. Supporting the German SS were the Ukrainian Trawnicki Guards, recruited from Soviet POW camps. These men, many captured Red Army soldiers, were trained at the Trawnicki camp and pressed into service as auxiliaries. Their duties at Belzec included guarding the perimeter, escorting prisoners, and driving victims into gas chambers. Survivors recalled the particular brutality of these guards, who often beat and tormented prisoners with enthusiasm. For them, survival depended on obedience to their German overseers, creating a cycle of violence where cruelty was a form of protection. Many of these Ukrainians were poorly educated and indoctrinated during training, making them easily manipulated by SS authority. Their participation allowed the Germans to maintain a small number of staff while still controlling thousands of victims. Testimonies highlight their role in shootings, punishments, and maintaining order during deportations. They became indispensable in the mechanics of mass killing, acting as the foot soldiers of genocide. Their presence at Belzec shows how local populations were coerced or enticed into collaboration. The bureaucracy behind Belzec extended far beyond the barbed wire. Railway officials in the Reichsbahn scheduled the trains that delivered victims with precision. Clerks, administrators, and mid-level functionaries processed deportation lists and timetables without ever setting foot in the camp. Each bureaucrat contributed to the seamless operation of death, transforming genocide into paperwork. The banality of this administration masked the reality of what was occurring at Belzec. These officials rarely saw the faces of those they condemned, insulating themselves from guilt. They operated under the illusion of neutrality, merely following orders or performing routine duties. Yet their pens, stamps, and signatures determined life or death for countless individuals. Belzec could not have functioned without their cooperation, proving that genocide required both killers and clerks. This faceless bureaucracy allowed the camp to operate efficiently and invisibly, buried under official documentation and secrecy. The SS officers and guards developed a culture of camaraderie within Belzec, shielding themselves from the moral weight of their crimes. Drinking parties, shared meals, and a distorted sense of pride bound them together in complicity. They often dehumanized victims by referring to them with slurs, reducing empathy to nothing. Stories circulated among them about their work treating murder as routine labor. This culture ensured silence, discouraging dissent or hesitation among staff. Even those who may have felt unease were swept into the collective mentality of the unit. The presence of Ukrainian auxiliaries reinforced this group dynamic, creating an us versus them environment within the camp. Belzec thus operated not only through orders from above, but through the social cohesion of its perpetrators. In this setting, atrocities became normalized and cruelty became casual. The perpetrators shielded themselves in routine and camaraderie, convincing themselves they were simply doing a job. The perpetrators of Belzec were not only executioners but innovators of murder. They refined techniques of mass killing that would later be applied in Treblinka and Sobibor. Their experiments with gas chambers, deception methods, and body disposal turned the camp into a laboratory of genocide. Worth and his men sought constant improvement, treating extermination like a technical problem to be solved. The corpses piling up in mass graves created logistical challenges, leading to the development of cremation pits. Efficiency was measured not in productivity, but in the speed and scale of killing. The perpetrators applied organizational skills to destruction, mirroring industrial processes. Their detached focus on methods revealed a chilling indifference to human life. Belzec's perpetrators did not see victims as people, but as obstacles in a system to be managed. In this way, the camp became a test site for perfecting genocide as policy. After the war, many of Belzec's perpetrators escaped accountability. Some, like Christian Worth, were killed before facing trial, while others blended back into society unnoticed. A handful were prosecuted during the post-war decades, but sentences were often light compared to the enormity of their crimes. Many of the Ukrainian guards disappeared into anonymity, their roles forgotten or minimized. The bureaucrats who scheduled trains and signed documents often resumed their careers without consequence. This lack of justice deepened the silence surrounding Belzec, compounding the erasure of its victims. Only decades later did historians begin to fully uncover the roles of these perpetrators. Testimonies from survivors and documents pieced together the names behind the machinery of death. The story of Belzec's perpetrators shows how ordinary men, through ideology and obedience, became instruments of genocide. Their legacy stands as a warning of how bureaucracy, cruelty, and silence can converge into atrocity. Life inside Belzec was marked by a brutal paradox. Though designed as a death camp, a small number of prisoners were forced to live temporarily in order to facilitate the killing process. These men and women were organized into labor detachments known as Sonderkommando, whose tasks revolved around maintaining the machinery of extermination. They unloaded trains, sorted belongings, cleaned the camp, and most harrowingly, handled the disposal of corpses. Their existence was precarious, for the SS routinely executed them to eliminate witnesses, replacing them with new arrivals. This cycle of forced complicity left survivors haunted with guilt and trauma that lasted long after the war. The Sonderkommando lived under constant fear, knowing that their survival depended on their utility to the Nazis. They were forbidden from communicating with deportees about their fate, forced instead to play roles in the charade of deception. The SS sought to turn victims into unwilling participants in their own destruction. For the prisoners, survival meant enduring the unendurable, a daily compromise with death. In Belzec, life was never more than a fragile extension of imminent annihilation. Starvation was a central feature of life inside Belzec, deliberately used as a weapon of control. Prisoners received minimal rations, often consisting of watery soup and scraps of bread unfit for consumption. Malnutrition quickly set in, weakening bodies and dulling resistance against the relentless pace of forced labor. The physical decline was accompanied by constant thirst, as clean water was scarce and deliberately withheld. Prisoners scavenged for food when they could, eating grass, roots, or scraps from garbage pits. Starvation was not accidental neglect, but calculated policy, ensuring prisoners were too weak to rebel. The SS observed this decay with indifference, regarding hunger as a tool to enforce submission. Those who collapsed at work were beaten or executed on the spot, their weakness seen as uselessness. The hunger gnawed at prisoners, reducing them to shadows of themselves within weeks. In Belzec, hunger was both a torment and a slow executioner. Daily brutality defined existence within the camp, with SS guards and Ukrainian auxiliaries wielding absolute power over life and death. Beatings were routine, often inflicted for trivial or invented infractions, such as pausing during work or failing to obey instantly. Prisoners lived in a state of terror, knowing that violence could erupt at any moment. Whips, rifle butts, and clubs became extensions of authority, leaving bodies broken and scarred. Executions were carried out openly, serving as warnings to others about the futility of defiance. Public hangings or shootings reinforced the omnipresence of death, turning survival into a psychological ordeal. Guards often exercised cruelty for sport, staging mock punishments or humiliating prisoners. The randomness of brutality deepened despair, making prisoners feel utterly powerless. Fear became part of daily routine, as predictable as labor or starvation. Life inside Belzec was shaped by violence as much as by the shadow of extermination itself. The work linked to the disposal of corpses placed the Sonderkommando at the heart of Belzec's horror. After each gassing, they were forced to enter chambers filled with bodies and drag them out. Victims were stripped of clothing, valuables, and even gold teeth, all under the watch of SS officers. The corpses were piled into mass graves, or later cremated in open-air pits to conceal evidence. This gruesome labor required extraordinary physical effort in conditions of exhaustion and starvation. The stench of decomposition hung over the camp, seeping into the prisoner's skin and memory. Psychological torment accompanied the physical burden, as Sonderkommando knew they were handling the remains of their own communities. They were trapped in a cycle of survival built upon complicity in murder. The work left indelible scars, with survivors haunted by visions of countless faceless dead. In Belzec, corpse disposal was not only a task, but an extension of the extermination process itself. The psychological torment of survival at Belzec was perhaps the most unbearable burden. Sonderkommando lived with the knowledge that their lives were extended only to perpetuate the deaths of others. They were witnesses to mass killings yet silenced by fear and the certainty of their own eventual execution. Survivors described feeling trapped in a nightmare without escape, a world where morality was twisted beyond recognition. Bonds of solidarity sometimes formed, but these were fragile under the crushing weight of daily survival. Some prisoners clung to small rituals, such as sharing scraps of food or whispered prayers, as a means of preserving humanity. Others withdrew into numbness, detaching themselves from the horrors around them. The uncertainty of each day intensified the psychological toll, as no one knew when their usefulness would end. The torment of survival became a wound that remained long after liberation. For those who endured, memory itself was a curse as much as a duty. The camp's deception added to the psychological torture of prisoners forced to assist in extermination. Sonderkommando were compelled to act calm and authoritative in front of new arrivals, maintaining the illusion of resettlement. They watched as men, women, and children were herded toward their deaths, forbidden to speak the truth. This role left them with unbearable guilt, as they could do nothing to warn or save their fellow victims. Survivors recalled the agony of recognizing faces among the condemned, neighbors, friends, even relatives. The Nazis exploited this forced complicity, ensuring that prisoners bore the weight of silence. Guards deliberately mocked them, taunting that they were accomplices in the killing machine. This psychological manipulation deepened feelings of shame and despair, even as survival demanded compliance. The deception was not only aimed at the victims, but also at breaking the spirits of those trapped in the machinery. At Belzec, survival was inseparable from moral torment. The physical environment of the camp reinforced despair and hopelessness. Overcrowded barracks housed prisoners in filthy conditions, with straw bedding crawling with lice and vermin. Disease spread rapidly, fueled by poor sanitation, lack of clean water, and untreated wounds. Typhus, dysentery, and other illnesses weakened already starving bodies, killing many without bullets or gas. Medical care was non-existent, as prisoners were considered expendable. The camp's design emphasized confinement and surveillance, with guard towers ensuring that every movement was visible. Escape was nearly impossible, and attempts were punished with mass executions. Prisoners often worked outdoors in harsh weather, exposed to the freezing cold of winter or scorching summer heat. The environment itself seemed weaponized against human endurance. Each day lived in Belzec was another day of suffering under conditions designed to annihilate both body and spirit. Despite the overwhelming brutality, faint traces of human resilience persisted among prisoners. Some found courage in small acts of defiance, like slowing work, sharing information, or quietly praying. Others clung to memories of family and community, using them as sources of inner strength. Bonds formed in desperation, with prisoners supporting each other through whispered words of comfort. Survival often depended on these fragile networks of solidarity, however temporary. There were moments when prisoners tried to resist psychologically, refusing to surrender their identities, despite systematic dehumanization. Even the act of enduring another day became an act of defiance in a world designed to erase them. Yet this resilience was always fragile, crushed by the relentless machinery of extermination. The reality remained that life inside Belzec was measured in days or weeks, not years. For most, survival was fleeting, but their endurance left testimony to the human spirit under unimaginable conditions. These fragments of resilience form part of the legacy of life inside Belzec. Resistance inside Belzec was nearly impossible, given the camp's design, the brutality of the guards, and the absolute control exerted by the SS. Yet, even in such an environment of terror, prisoners found ways to express their humanity through small acts of defiance. These gestures were rarely open rebellion, but rather quiet refusals to surrender dignity. Some prisoners whispered prayers, refusing to let faith be extinguished by the machinery of death. Others sabotaged their work in subtle ways, damaging tools or slowing tasks, despite the risk of execution. Even a shared smile or whispered word of solidarity was an act of defiance in a camp built to annihilate the human spirit. The Sonderkommando especially sought ways to preserve traces of dignity while forced into the most horrific tasks. They sometimes carved secret marks into wood or walls, faint reminders that they had lived. Though such acts could not stop the killings, they represented a refusal to be reduced to silence. In Belzec, resistance began with the decision to remain human in a place designed for dehumanization. Escape attempts, though rare, did occur in Belzec, despite the overwhelming odds stacked against prisoners. The camp was heavily guarded, surrounded by barbed wire, watchtowers, and armed SS men with dogs. Prisoners who tried to flee risked not only their own lives, but also brutal reprisals against others. Still, desperation sometimes outweighed fear, and individuals attempted daring escapes. Accounts tell of prisoners who used moments of chaos during train arrivals to slip away. Others tried to crawl through ditches or hide among piles of discarded clothing. Few succeeded, and many were caught and executed publicly to terrify others into submission. The impossibility of escape was compounded by the camp's remote location, surrounded by hostile territory where locals feared Nazi punishment for aiding fugitives. Yet even the attempt to escape symbolized hope and resistance against despair. These stories remind us that even in Belzec, the human will to fight for life did not vanish completely. Sabotage took many forms within the camp, carried out quietly by those forced to serve the machinery of extermination. Some Sonderkommando damaged gas chamber doors, creating leaks that slowed the killing process and forced repairs. Others mishandled equipment, spoiled supplies, or concealed tools in the hope of using them later for rebellion. Prisoners assigned to sort belongings sometimes destroyed valuables rather than hand them over to the Nazis. The risks of discovery were immense, as sabotage meant certain execution if detected. Still, these actions were motivated by a desperate need to resist, even when success seemed impossible. Even slowing down the pace of killing by a few hours felt like a victory to those trapped in the camp. Such resistance could not halt the machinery of death, but it proved that victims refused to become passive instruments of their oppressors. Sabotage was resistance by survival, a quiet but powerful statement of defiance. In Belzec, these tiny acts became a thread of hope in a tapestry of despair. Secret messages smuggled out of Belzec stand among the most remarkable acts of resistance. Prisoners risked their lives to write testimonies on scraps of paper, hiding them in clothing, shoes, or buried near the camp. These messages contain names, dates, and accounts of atrocities intended to reach the outside world. A few of these desperate notes were found after the war, bearing witness to what the prisoners endured. Writing such messages was itself an act of rebellion, as it preserved memory in defiance of Nazi attempts to erase all traces of murder. Prisoners knew they might not survive, but they wanted their words to carry forward the truth. The act of recording horrors in real time was both testimony and protest. Guards constantly searched for such writings, making discovery a death sentence for the author. Yet, in moments of courage, prisoners still chose to write, their voices surviving beyond their destruction. Through these scraps of testimony, we hear the whispers of defiance from within Belzec. The odds of organized resistance were nearly insurmountable at Belzec, given the camp's small prisoner population and rapid liquidation process. Unlike larger camps, where thousands might remain alive for longer periods, Belzec maintained only a few hundred laborers at any given time. The SS regularly killed Sonderkommando groups to prevent collective planning, ensuring a constant rotation of terrified new workers. This cycle destroyed the possibility of building long-term networks or planning revolts. Armed resistance required weapons, which were nearly impossible to obtain inside the camp. Even tools like knives or hammers were tightly monitored and only briefly available during work assignments. The guards' constant surveillance made conspiracies extraordinarily dangerous, with spies and informers adding to the risks. Yet the prisoners who dreamed of uprising clung to this hope as a mental escape. In their whispered conversations, rebellion remained alive even when action proved impossible. Belzec was designed to crush resistance, but the dream of it endured in secret hearts. Desperation drove prisoners to acts that, though small, carried great symbolic weight. Some chose to spit at guards or curse them in final moments before execution. Others walked to their deaths with songs or prayers on their lips, refusing to be stripped of spirit. These acts were not grand revolts, but quiet assertions of identity and dignity in the face of annihilation. a prisoner lighting a final cigarette or holding the hand of a comrade in the gas chamber carried defiance as strong as armed resistance. Even in starvation, some refused food that was stolen from fellow victims, insisting on ethical choices to the end. The Nazis sought to dehumanize, but these gestures reasserted humanity. Guards often tried to crush such spirit with renewed brutality, but the persistence of dignity frustrated their efforts. Resistance in this sense became survival of self-respect. Even in Belzec, where death was inevitable, the human soul fought to remain unbroken. The psychological burden of attempted resistance weighed heavily on prisoners, who knew failure meant collective punishment. Those who dreamed of revolt feared that their actions would bring death to their comrades. The Nazis exploited this fear, making every act of defiance a question of life or death for many. This manipulation forced prisoners into impossible moral dilemmas, balancing hope for freedom against the safety of others. Survivors later spoke of the agony of inaction, haunted by what could have been attempted but was not. Others insisted that even the smallest acts of resistance mattered, as they preserved memory and dignity. The Nazis designed Belzec to annihilate not only lives, but also the possibility of collective resistance. Yet the moral struggle itself became a form of defiance, proof that prisoners still thought in terms of justice and humanity. To resist in thought, even when action was impossible, was itself an act of survival. The torment of these choices reflected the crushing reality of life inside Belzec. In the end, resistance at Belzec was less about overthrowing the camp and more about preserving traces of truth and humanity. The Nazis succeeded in preventing open rebellion, but they failed to extinguish the will to defy. Small acts of sabotage, desperate escapes, whispered prayers, and smuggled notes became fragments of rebellion in a place built for silence. These gestures, when pieced together, form a narrative of courage in the darkest of circumstances. Survivors and historians remind us that resistance is not always measured in battles won, but in humanity preserved. In Belzec, to whisper a prayer, or to write a secret note, was to strike against erasure. To share food or risk punishment, to help another, was to refuse the Nazi vision of total dehumanization. Resistance and desperation were inseparable, as prisoners balanced survival with dignity. In the machinery of death, they carved out fleeting victories of spirit. These moments, though small, remain powerful reminders of defiance in the face of annihilation. The killing operations at Belzec reached an unprecedented scale in a remarkably short time. Between March and December of 1942, approximately 500,000 Jews were exterminated within its barbed wire confines. Unlike Auschwitz, which combined forced labor with extermination, Belzec was designed with only one purpose: immediate mass killing. Deportees rarely spent more than a few hours alive after arrival. Trains unloaded thousands at a time, with SS officers and Ukrainian guards forcing them through the deception-laden process of undressing and marching to the gas chambers. Within 30 minutes of arrival, most transports were reduced to silence. The camp's efficiency made it one of the deadliest killing sites in Nazi-occupied Europe. Belzec killed more Jews in less than a year than many camps did in their entire existence. This scale was not only staggering, but also horrifying in its quiet efficiency. The world only began to understand the magnitude of this slaughter after the war's end. When compared with other Operation Reinhard camps like Treblinka and Sobibor, Belzec stands out as the testing ground for extermination methods. Treblinka would eventually surpass Belzec in terms of numbers killed, with around 800,000 victims. Sobibor claimed approximately 250,000 lives, while Majdanek combined forced labor with around 80,000 deaths. Yet Belzec's figure of 500,000 in under a year makes it one of the most lethal camps per day of operation. This efficiency was the direct result of the lessons the SS learned from its early trial killings. Gas chambers were expanded, rail logistics were perfected, and the pace of deportations increased rapidly. By mid-1942, transports were arriving almost daily, often filled with Jews from Galicia, Krakow, and Lublin. The rapid turnover of victims allowed the Nazis to annihilate entire regional populations in a matter of weeks. Belzec was not only a death camp but also a laboratory for industrialized extermination. Its statistics tell the story of genocide executed with cold precision. The near-total destruction of Jewish communities in southeastern Poland illustrates the catastrophic scale of Belzec's operations. Cities like Lublin, Lwów, and Krakow saw their centuries-old Jewish populations deported almost entirely to Belzec. Smaller towns, once vibrant centers of Jewish life with synagogues, schools, and marketplaces, vanished in a matter of weeks. Villages that had been home to Jewish families for generations were rendered empty. Their inhabitants marched onto cattle cars bound for Belzec. By the end of 1942, the Jewish presence in Galicia had been all but eradicated. Survivors from these areas were rare, often numbering in only the dozens out of populations once in the tens of thousands. The extermination left not just physical absence but also a cultural void, erasing centuries of tradition, language, and heritage. Belzec's impact can thus be measured not only in lives lost, but in entire communities destroyed. Its role in the Holocaust was annihilation on both human and cultural levels. The devastation was complete and irreversible. The German railways, or Reichsbahn, played a central role in the scale of Belzec's death toll. Trains brought victims from across Poland and neighboring territories with chilling regularity. Deportations were scheduled with bureaucratic precision, often masking themselves as resettlement transports. Each train carried between 1,000 and 2,000 people packed into cattle cars with little air, food, or water. Many died en route, their corpses arriving alongside the living. Survivors staggered out of the wagons only to be marched directly to the gas chambers. The efficiency of the railway system meant that Belzec could process thousands daily, sustaining its killing capacity without pause. This logistical machine was as much a weapon of extermination as the gas chambers themselves. German clerks and station managers signed documents that ensured the trains ran on time, making genocide a matter of routine scheduling. The combination of railway efficiency and camp mechanics created the terrifying scale of Belzec's operations. Testimonies from surrounding villagers add a haunting perspective to the scale of death at Belzec. Locals reported seeing endless trains arrive, often hearing screams from inside the wagons. They saw smoke rising from burning pits and smelled the stench of decomposing bodies carried by the wind. Many were forced to work nearby, building railways or digging trenches, all the while aware of what was happening behind the fences. Some risked their lives to sneak food or water to prisoners, though such gestures were rare under the constant threat of execution. Others watched in silence, paralyzed by fear, knowing that resistance meant death. After the war, their testimonies became vital in piecing together what had occurred inside Belzec. They recalled the eerie quiet that followed the train's arrivals, when entire transports disappeared in hours. For them, Belzec was a neighbor that devoured human beings daily. Their stories reveal the way genocide unfolded in plain sight, even when veiled in terror. The methodical killings created a death toll so high that even the perpetrators struggled with corpse disposal. Initially, victims were buried in mass graves dug by prisoners under SS supervision, but as the number of dead grew into hundreds of thousands, The ground swelled with decomposing bodies, and the stench carried for miles. By mid-1942, the SS realized the need for cremation to conceal the evidence. Giant pyres were constructed, and corpses were exhumed and burned in horrifying quantities. Witnesses recalled flames visible for miles at night, and the choking smell of burning flesh. The operation was systematic, with prisoners forced to handle the gruesome work under constant guard. Cremation allowed the Nazis to maintain their pace of killing while attempting to erase physical proof. Yet even in their attempt to hide crimes, the scale of slaughter left indelible traces in the soil and air. Belzec had become a factory of death operating at full capacity. What makes Belzec particularly chilling is the near-total absence of survivors. Out of the 500,000 victims, only a handful lived to tell the tale. Most of what we know comes from these few survivors and the testimonies of villagers and perpetrators. This scarcity of witnesses is itself a testament to the camp's efficiency. Unlike Auschwitz, where forced labor created a slim chance of survival, Belzec allowed virtually no escape from death. Its victims disappeared without names, graves, or even ashes, their existence erased almost completely. Historians face the challenge of reconstructing its history from fragments, statistics, and limited first-hand accounts. The lack of survivors makes Belzec one of the most silent yet devastating sites of the Holocaust. In this silence lies its horror, an extermination camp so efficient that nearly no one lived to tell the story. Belzec's legacy is one of annihilation without trace. The statistics of Belzec represent more than numbers. They embody the destruction of 500,000 lives and countless futures. Each figure reflects a family torn apart, a culture erased, a story left untold. When compared with other Reinhard camps, Belzec may seem overshadowed by Treblinka's higher death toll, yet its role as the prototype makes it uniquely significant. Its efficiency proved to the Nazis that genocide could be conducted as an administrative process, fueling even larger massacres elsewhere. For local communities, the camp's shadow lingers as a wound that never healed. Testimonies from villagers confirm that they witnessed the machinery of death daily, unable to intervene. The scale of Belzec's killing operation makes it a central chapter in the Holocaust, though it remains less known to the wider world. Remembering the statistics forces us to confront not only the enormity of death, but the machinery that made it possible. Belzec shows how bureaucracy, technology, and ideology combined to exterminate. Its scale is a reminder of the depths to which humanity can fall. By late 1942, Belzec had completed the grim task for which it was designed: the extermination of the Jewish population of southeastern Poland. With hundreds of thousands already murdered, the Nazi leadership decided the camp's mission was fulfilled. Operation Reinhard shifted its primary killing operations to Sobibor and Treblinka, which would continue exterminations on a massive scale. Belzec, in contrast, was marked for closure, not out of mercy, but out of cold calculation. The camp had served its purpose as a prototype, refining methods of mass killing that were later perfected elsewhere. But its existence, if left untouched, threatened to reveal the enormity of the crime. German officials feared that advancing Soviet armies or post-war investigators might uncover the evidence. To preempt discovery, the SS initiated a systematic cover-up. This effort would become as ruthless and methodical as the killing itself. The story of Belzec's dismantling reveals a chilling attempt to erase genocide from history. The first stage of this cover-up was the exhumation of the mass graves. For months, thousands of corpses lay buried in pits that could not contain the scale of death. Decomposition caused the ground to rise, and the stench carried for miles, drawing unwanted attention. Heinrich Himmler, ever concerned with secrecy, ordered that the bodies be destroyed. Prisoner labor detachments, known as Sonderkommando, were forced to dig up the graves under constant SS supervision. This gruesome task required prisoners to handle rotting corpses, often using hooks and bare hands. Once unearthed, the bodies were piled onto massive pyres made of railway tracks and wooden beams. Gasoline and oil were poured over the piles, and the corpses were set ablaze in horrifyingly large cremations. Flames and smoke filled the skies above Belzec for weeks, a final act of destruction. This was not merely about disposal, but about obliterating evidence of mass murder. The process of burning was itself industrialized, echoing the mechanized killing that had defined Belzec. Corpses were arranged in layers, alternating with wood and kindling in giant grids of fire. Once ignited, the flames devoured thousands of bodies in a single inferno. To increase efficiency, the SS ordered prisoners to crush remaining bones and scatter the ashes. The soil was mixed with the charred remains, spreading human traces into the earth. The goal was to make it impossible for future investigators to count or identify the dead. Locals who lived nearby recalled seeing the black smoke that stained the horizon. They spoke of the choking smell of burning flesh drifting across the countryside. The cremations became a macabre landmark of the region, known even to those who could not see inside the fences. Belzec's dismantling turned the camp itself into a furnace of concealment. In this act, the Nazis attempted to destroy both lives and memory. After the cremations, the camp's physical infrastructure was systematically demolished. The gas chambers, once the center of Belzec's operation, were torn down brick by brick. Barracks and administrative buildings were dismantled, with wood and metal either reused or destroyed. Watchtowers and fences were removed, erasing the visible signs of imprisonment. The railway spur that had delivered countless victims was disassembled, leaving little trace of its deadly function. Even the perimeter ditches and roads leading to the camp were leveled. The SS treated the destruction of Belzec as another engineering project, designed to conceal rather than construct. Every building that bore witness to mass extermination was obliterated. What remained was a barren field scarred by ashes and bones. Yet even in destruction, the ground itself could not fully hide the enormity of what had transpired. To further disguise the site, the SS undertook a campaign of deliberate landscaping. The former camp grounds were ploughed over and covered with layers of soil to flatten the terrain. Grass was sown, and young pine trees were planted, transforming the killing field into something resembling a peaceful forest. This process was not accidental, but part of a calculated effort to disguise Belzec as a natural landscape. The planting of trees was symbolic as well as practical, an attempt to erase memory through the passage of time and growth of nature. Paths that once led to gas chambers were turned into unremarkable clearings. Graves that had contained thousands were replaced with saplings and bushes. To casual eyes, Belzec no longer looked like a place of horror. The Nazis believed they had succeeded in burying both the dead and the truth. But beneath the soil, the earth held its secrets in silence. The final deception was to repurpose the site, ensuring that it would not draw suspicion. A farmhouse was built on the grounds, and a Ukrainian family was settled there to tend the land. This domestic facade was meant to suggest that the area had always been agricultural. The presence of livestock and crops concealed the soil still saturated with ash and human remains. Neighbors who passed by would see ordinary rural life rather than the traces of industrial murder. The SS believed that this disguise would withstand scrutiny, even if foreign eyes examined the site after the war. Such calculated repurposing shows the lengths to which the regime went to conceal its crimes. Belzec had been turned from a death camp into a deceptive farmstead, yet those who lived nearby could never forget the fires and smoke that had once defined the landscape. The transformation was a mask, thinly veiling the memory of atrocity. For the prisoners forced to dismantle Belzec, the work was itself a death sentence. Sonderkommando laborers who exhumed corpses and destroyed buildings were killed once their tasks were complete. The SS left almost no living witnesses who could later testify about the cover-up. Only a handful survived by chance or miraculous escape, their testimonies later invaluable to historians. This deliberate elimination of witnesses was the final act of secrecy. Belzec was not only dismantled physically, but silenced through murder. The camp became a place where even memory was hunted down and destroyed. Survivors who did speak recalled the dismantling as even more horrific than the killings, because it forced them to erase their own people. The cover-up, in its cruelty, extended the crime beyond death. It was genocide against memory itself. Belzec's dismantling was both physical destruction and psychological obliteration. Yet despite the Nazis' efforts, Belzec could not be entirely erased from history. The earth continued to reveal human remains, unearthed by weather, animals, and later investigators. Testimonies from locals confirmed the terrible events that had taken place. After the war, Jewish organizations and Allied war crimes investigators documented the traces that remained. Even with trees and farms covering the ground, the silence of Belzec was haunted by the ghosts of 500,000 lives. Its dismantling, rather than hiding the crime, became part of the evidence of Nazi attempts to conceal genocide. Historians now view Belzec as a critical link in understanding Operation Reinhard and the mechanics of mass murder. The attempt to erase the camp underscores the Nazis' awareness of their guilt. It shows that they knew history would judge them, even as they tried to bury the truth. Belzec's dismantling remains a testament to both atrocity and denial, a scar hidden beneath the earth. One of the most chilling aspects of Belzec's history is that fewer than 10 individuals are known to have survived the camp. Unlike Auschwitz or Majdanek, Belzec was designed purely as an extermination center, leaving almost no chance of life. Those who entered were overwhelmingly destined for immediate death in the gas chambers. The few survivors were either members of Sonderkommando labor detachments or prisoners who managed to escape in extraordinary circumstances. Their survival was not the result of mercy, but of chance, desperation, or remarkable cunning. These rare voices became vital after the war, serving as the only direct testimonies from within Belzec's killing grounds. Each survivor carried the burden of recounting horrors that few could imagine. Their words offered a glimpse into a world that the Nazis tried so hard to erase. Without them, Belzec might have remained a silent void in Holocaust history. Their survival ensured that truth pierced through attempted oblivion. Among the known survivors, figures such as Rudolf Ritter stand out as irreplaceable witnesses. Ritter, a Polish Jew deported to Belzec in 1942, was spared immediate death because he was chosen for forced labor. He was tasked with work inside the camp, witnessing firsthand the extermination process that claimed so many lives. His escape was almost miraculous, occurring during a transport mission outside the camp. After the war, Ritter gave detailed testimony to Jewish historical commissions in Poland. His account remains one of the most significant primary sources on Belzec. In painstaking detail, he described the gas chambers, the deception used against prisoners, and the mechanics of mass killing. Ritter's testimony became a cornerstone for historical understanding, corroborating fragmented evidence left behind. Through him, Belzec's otherwise silenced victims were given a voice. His survival was both rare and profoundly consequential. Other survivors, though fewer in number, contributed crucial fragments of testimony. Each account illuminated aspects of Belzec's operation that could not be reconstructed from documents alone. Some spoke of the deceptions upon arrival, when victims were told they would be disinfected before labor. Others described the brutality of the Ukrainian Trawnicki guards, who carried out much of the physical violence. The testimonies also revealed details of the camp's geography, the layout of barracks, fences, and gas chambers. Survivors explained how labor detachments worked under the constant threat of execution. They also spoke of the unbearable psychological torment of disposing of corpses from the gas chambers. Even in fragments, these accounts created a mosaic of truth. Together, they revealed the industrial efficiency of Belzec's killing process. In their scarcity, these testimonies carried immense weight, becoming a lifeline to history. Beyond the survivors, Polish villagers in the surrounding region became inadvertent witnesses to Belzec's crimes. Living near the railway lines, they saw the endless convoys of cattle cars packed with human beings. They noticed that trains arrived full and left empty, their silence punctuated by the cries of the dying. The villagers recalled the constant smoke rising from the camp and the unbearable stench that drifted across the countryside. Some spoke of fields where ash and bone fragments spread across the soil after mass cremations. Others remembered the sound of gunfire echoing from within the barbed wire. These local witnesses may not have seen the gas chambers themselves, but they understood the scale of the killing. Their testimonies added external confirmation to survivor accounts. Together they provided a broader picture of Belzec's place within the local landscape. These voices ensured that Belzec's horrors could not be completely hidden. Railway workers also played a key role as witnesses to Belzec's machinery of death. Employed by the German Reichsbahn, they operated or serviced the trains that brought victims to the camp. Many remembered the inhumane conditions inside the cattle cars, people crammed together, suffocating, without food or water. Some recalled the haunting sounds of fists pounding on wooden walls, desperate cries for air, and children wailing in the darkness. Workers testified to the overwhelming stench when trains were opened, sometimes revealing corpses who had died en route. They also saw how German guards treated those too weak to walk, dragging or shooting them on the spot. For these railwaymen, the transports became a grim routine, repeated day after day. After the war, their testimonies were critical in documenting how the Reichsbahn facilitated genocide. They proved that Belzec was not an isolated site, but part of a wider logistical system. The trains themselves became instruments of extermination. The scarcity of survivors meant that even the smallest testimony was invaluable. Unlike Auschwitz, where thousands survived to speak, Belzec's direct voices were vanishingly few. This made the surrounding witnesses, villagers, railwaymen, and even German personnel, essential in piecing together the history. Some German soldiers who had been stationed near Belzec later described what they had seen or heard. A handful of SS men, captured after the war, gave statements that inadvertently confirmed survivor testimonies. These overlapping accounts created a framework for historical truth. They demonstrated how genocide relied not only on the killers, but also on the silent complicity of those who observed. Each witness, whether a survivor or an outsider, held a fragment of Belzec's hidden story. Only by assembling all these fragments could historians reconstruct the enormity of what happened. The importance of their voices cannot be overstated. The testimonies also carried profound emotional weight, revealing not just facts but the human experience of atrocity. Survivors described the overwhelming terror of arrival, the helplessness of watching loved ones dragged away, and the despair of forced labor. They spoke of hunger, cold, beatings, and the constant expectation of death. Villagers recounted their horror at the sight of smoke rising daily from the camp. Railway workers described feelings of helplessness, shame and fear as they operated trains that transported victims. Each testimony was layered with trauma, often retold with visible pain decades after the war. For many, speaking out was a moral duty, a way to honor the memory of those who could not speak. Their words preserved the humanity of the victims in the face of dehumanization. Through them, the silence imposed by the Nazis was broken. Memory survived because witnesses refused to remain silent. The rarity of Belzec testimonies has made them among the most valuable sources in Holocaust history. With fewer than 10 direct survivors, each voice carried the responsibility of representing 500,000 silenced lives. Their testimonies were preserved in post-war commissions, war crimes trials, and later historical studies. For decades, Belzec was overshadowed by Auschwitz and Treblinka, but these accounts ensured it was never forgotten. The courage of those who spoke despite immense trauma preserved truth against denial and oblivion. Historians today recognize the witness testimonies as essential in reconstructing the camp's reality. They demonstrate that even when Nazis tried to obliterate all evidence, memory endured through human voices. The survivors and witnesses ensured that Belzec remained part of the world's collective conscience. Their words turned absence into remembrance and silence into testimony. In their survival, history itself was saved from erasure. When Belzec was liberated by the advancing Soviet army in July 1944, what they found was not a functioning camp but a ghostly void. The site had been dismantled by the Nazis almost 2 years earlier, leaving only faint traces of foundations, disturbed earth, and scattered human remains. The Soviets immediately recognized that they had stumbled upon the remnants of a mass killing center, but evidence was limited. Their first reports emphasized the physical state of the ground, noting areas where soil was unnaturally raised and ashes mixed with bones lay near the surface. The Red Army's Extraordinary Commission for the Investigation of German Crimes documented testimonies from nearby villagers. These locals spoke of the endless trains, the smoke, and the unbearable stench during the camp's operation. The Soviet investigators understood that a genocide had taken place, but their report lacked forensic depth. They were constrained by the absence of buildings or records. Still, their findings represented the first attempt to memorialize Belzec's crimes. It was the beginning of a long struggle to preserve the truth. In parallel, Polish authorities began conducting their own inquiries into Belzec's crimes. The Polish Main Commission for the Investigation of German Crimes collected testimonies from survivors, villagers, and railway workers. These accounts provided chilling details of deportations, the gas chambers, and the methods of mass killing. They confirmed the scale of extermination, estimating hundreds of thousands of victims transported to Belzec. However, because so few people survived, Polish investigators faced a severe shortage of direct witnesses. They relied heavily on circumstantial evidence, train schedules, deportation records, and scattered Nazi documents. In many cases, they also exhumed small areas of soil to confirm the presence of human remains. These grim findings strengthened the case against the Nazi perpetrators, showing that Belzec had been a central component of Operation Reinhard. The Polish inquiries were an essential step in establishing the historical record. They ensured that Belzec could not be dismissed as rumor or exaggeration. The earliest war crimes trials concerning Belzec were held in the immediate post-war years. Soviet and Polish courts prosecuted several captured SS men and collaborators. Some were former Ukrainian Trawniki guards who were accused of assisting in the killings and brutal treatment of prisoners. In these early trials, Witness testimonies were crucial because so little physical evidence remained. Judges often relied on survivors' accounts, however rare, and corroborated them with testimonies from villagers. The sentences ranged from imprisonment to death, reflecting the enormity of the crimes committed. Yet not all perpetrators were caught or prosecuted in these years. Many fled into hiding, changed identities, or disappeared into civilian life. Others, like high-ranking SS officers, had already been killed in the closing months of the war. These early trials, though limited in scope, set the foundation for future legal reckoning. They confirmed Belzec's role as a site of industrialized genocide. One of the greatest challenges in post-war investigations was the systematic destruction of the camp. By dismantling Belzec in late 1942, the Nazis had eliminated gas chambers, barracks, and cremation pits, leaving only disturbed soil as evidence. This erasure made forensic proof extraordinarily difficult to establish. Investigators faced questions from skeptics and deniers, who claimed the lack of buildings undermined testimony. To counter this, Polish and Soviet teams conducted soil surveys and small-scale exhumations. They uncovered layers of ash, burned wood, and countless fragments of human bone. These discoveries left no doubt about the mass killings, even if the camp's architecture had vanished. Nonetheless, the lack of physical structures hindered broader recognition of Belzec's crimes in the early post-war years. It allowed the camp to fade from public awareness compared to Auschwitz or Majdanek, where more evidence survived. This absence of ruins became part of Belzec's tragic legacy. The most significant wave of trials concerning Belzec came much later, in the 1960s, during the Belzec trials held in Munich. By then, German prosecutors had launched investigations into Nazi war crimes as part of broader efforts to confront the past. Several former SS men, including camp guards and administrative staff, were brought to court. Among them was Josef Oberhauser, a former adjutant to Christian Wirth, who was one of the highest-ranking perpetrators associated with Belzec. The trials gathered hundreds of documents, deportation records, and testimonies to reconstruct the camp's operation. Survivors like Rudolf Ritter were called upon to testify once again, decades after their initial accounts. These trials were groundbreaking in bringing Belzec back into legal and historical focus. However, many sentences were light compared to the magnitude of the crimes. Still, they represented an official acknowledgement by German courts of Belzec's extermination role. Despite these trials, investigators often encountered immense difficulties in gathering evidence. Many perpetrators claimed they had only been following orders, minimizing their roles in the killing process. Others insisted they had no knowledge of the extermination, portraying themselves as low-level clerks or guards. The lack of surviving documents from Belzec strengthened their claims, since there was little written proof to disprove them. Prosecutors relied on deportation records, which clearly showed the scale of transports into the camp. They also pieced together testimonies from survivors, villagers, and even other Nazis. Yet the defense often cast doubt on these accounts, exploiting the scarcity of direct witnesses. In this environment, securing harsh sentences was difficult. Still, the proceedings themselves forced public recognition of Belzec's crimes. They ensured that the atrocities were discussed in courtrooms and entered into official records. The trials thus served both legal and historical purposes. The post-war investigations also revealed the bureaucratic machinery behind Belzec's operation. German prosecutors traced the role of the Reichsbahn, which scheduled and operated the trains to the camp. They examined the files of the SS and police offices in Lublin, which coordinated deportations. They highlighted the responsibility of figures like Odilo Globoknik and Christian Worth, whose policies created Belzec as part of Operation Reinhard. Court documents revealed that every level of Nazi bureaucracy, clerks, guards, administrators, and officers, played a role in making mass murder possible. The investigations underscored how genocide was not the work of a few isolated individuals, but of a system. This system included those who signed orders, organized logistics, and managed finances. Post-war legal proceedings exposed this web of complicity. They showed that Belzec was not an aberration but an intentional creation of the Nazi state. This understanding reshaped how historians and courts viewed accountability for genocide. Responsibility extended far beyond the camp fence. Ultimately, the post-war investigations into Belzec were marked by both achievement and limitation. On one hand, they succeeded in establishing Belzec as a site of systematic extermination, despite Nazi efforts to erase it. Testimonies, forensic evidence, and trials ensured the crimes could not be forgotten. On the other hand, the scarcity of survivors and the destruction of the camp limited how much detail could be reconstructed. Many perpetrators escaped justice entirely, blending into post-war society. Others received sentences far lighter than the scale of their crimes demanded. Yet even in their imperfection, the investigations kept Belzec in historical memory. They served as a warning about the dangers of erasure, denial, and delayed justice. They also highlighted the resilience of truth, which survived despite systematic efforts to destroy it. Through these inquiries, Belzec's voice remained faint but enduring, speaking across the silence of history. The post-war investigations ensured that Belzec would not vanish into oblivion. In the decades following the Second World War, Belzec faced a long struggle for recognition, overshadowed by the names of Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek. Unlike those camps, which had surviving structures and more survivors to testify, Belzec had been systematically dismantled in 1942. As a result, its history existed largely in fragments, scattered testimonies, deportation records, and the memories of nearby villagers. This erasure gave rise to a painful paradox. Despite nearly 500,000 victims, Belzec remained one of the least known extermination camps. The tragedy of Belzec was compounded not only by mass death, but also by post-war silence. Public memory prioritized larger sites where physical evidence remained intact. For decades, even in Poland, Belzec was rarely mentioned in textbooks or commemorative ceremonies. This absence fueled survivor frustration, as they felt their suffering had been relegated to historical margins. Belzec's struggle for recognition would prove as enduring as its legacy of atrocity. The fight to remember became an act of resistance against oblivion. The scarcity of survivors played a central role in Belzec's marginalization in memory. Fewer than 10 individuals are known to have survived Belzec's killing process, an almost unprecedented number compared to other camps. These survivors, such as Rudolf Ritter and Chaim Hersman, bore the impossible weight of representing hundreds of thousands of silenced voices. Ritter in particular gave testimony to Polish authorities in 1946, describing the machinery of extermination with haunting detail. His account became one of the only comprehensive first-hand narratives of Belzec's operation, yet even his voice was often drowned out in a post-war world, overwhelmed by the testimonies of Auschwitz survivors. Without a community of survivors to advocate consistently, Belzec was frequently absent from early Holocaust education. This lack of living witnesses left the camp particularly vulnerable to neglect. Survivor testimonies thus became both precious historical evidence and fragile lifelines for remembrance. They carried the camp's story into the historical record against overwhelming odds. Despite this silence, Survivor groups and Jewish organizations began pushing for Belzec's recognition in the 1950s and 1960s. They argued that Belzec's destruction should not diminish its importance, but instead highlight the completeness of its genocide. Groups such as Yad Vashem in Israel began incorporating Belzec into broader Holocaust research and commemoration. Jewish survivors from Poland scattered across Israel, the United States, and South America wrote memoirs that included recollections of family members lost to Belzec. In some cases, they erected private plaques and memorials in synagogues abroad to honor relatives. These acts of remembrance were often small, local, and deeply personal, but they were essential in keeping Belzec's memory alive. For many, remembering Belzec became an obligation of mourning, even without physical remains to anchor it. Survivor groups provided the foundation for later academic work and official memorialization. Their efforts were a quiet but determined struggle against historical erasure. Memory lived on in personal grief long before public recognition followed. The first official attempts to commemorate Belzec came in Poland during the 1960s, when local authorities erected a modest monument on the site. This early memorial consisted of a simple plaque and a fenced area, marking the camp's boundaries. It was symbolic but sparse, reflecting both limited resources and limited political will. During the communist era in Poland, discussions of Jewish suffering were often subsumed into a broader narrative of anti-fascist struggle. As a result, Belzec's Jewish victims were not always explicitly acknowledged in early memorial texts. Nevertheless, the existence of even a small marker was significant. It represented the first institutional acknowledgement that Belzec was a place of mass death. Visitors, though few, could at least recognize the ground as sacred. Yet, compared to Auschwitz's sprawling museum complex, Belzec's memorial remained minimal. This imbalance reflected the unequal weight given to different sites of genocide in early remembrance. Belzec's story was only partially told. Historians played a critical role in reviving Belzec's place in Holocaust scholarship. In the 1970s and 1980s, researchers like Raoul Hilberg and Yitzhak Arad published detailed studies on Operation Reinhard. They emphasized Belzec as the first fully operational death camp, a model for Sobibor and Treblinka. Their work highlighted how Belzec embodied the transition from mass shootings to industrialized gas chamber killings. Academic attention gradually began correcting the neglect that had surrounded the camp. Archival research into German documents, especially transport records, revealed the staggering number of victims deported there. These studies established Belzec as central to understanding the mechanics of the Holocaust. For the first time, Belzec was recognized not just as a footnote, but as a critical chapter in genocide. Historians' persistence ensured the camp would not vanish entirely from scholarly memory. Their work created the intellectual foundation upon which future memorialization could be built. History itself became an act of remembrance. The 1990s brought a renewed push for proper memorialization of Belzec, driven by survivors' families and Jewish organizations worldwide. As Poland transitioned out of communism, Holocaust memory began receiving greater attention. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and Yad Vashem both supported initiatives to improve Belzec's commemoration. In 1995, international pressure mounted for a proper memorial that would reflect the camp's scale. Survivor groups and Jewish leaders argued passionately that Belzec deserved recognition equal to Auschwitz and Treblinka. Their advocacy brought international funding and collaboration, ensuring resources were finally dedicated to the site. The momentum culminated in the construction of a major new memorial and museum in the early 2000s. This development marked a profound shift in Belzec's visibility. After decades of neglect, the camp was finally given a memorial worthy of its historical significance. The silence was being broken by a renewed global commitment to remembrance. The new Belzec Memorial, inaugurated in 2004, transformed the forgotten site into a solemn landscape of memory. The design, created by architects Andrzej Sołga, Zdzisław Pidek, and Marcin Roszczyk, reflected the enormity of loss. It featured a massive field of crushed stone covering the extermination grounds, evoking both absence and burial. Pathways guided visitors through the symbolic graveyard, leading them toward a memorial wall inscribed with victims' names. The museum accompanying the memorial provided historical context through documents, testimonies, and artifacts. Together, they created a space where history and mourning could coexist. The memorial emphasized silence, minimalism, and reflection, mirroring the void left by Belzec's destruction. For survivors' families, it offered a place to grieve and remember, even in the absence of marked graves. For visitors, it offered a visceral encounter with one of the Holocaust's most erased sites. Belzec's memory had finally been given physical form. The forgotten camp was remembered at last. Today, Belzec stands not only as a site of memory, but as a lesson in the fragility of remembrance. Its long journey from erasure to recognition illustrates how easily atrocity can be marginalized when evidence is scarce. Survivor testimonies, historians' persistence, and international advocacy were all essential in restoring Belzec's place in history. The camp's story warns of the dangers of selective memory, where some tragedies receive attention while others are neglected. It reminds us that absence itself can be a form of injustice, denying victims the dignity of remembrance. Belzec's memorial now welcomes visitors from around the world, educating new generations about its horrors. Through exhibitions, publications, and ceremonies, its memory is finally secure. Yet the responsibility to preserve that memory remains ongoing. Belzec challenges us to ensure that even the most silenced histories are spoken aloud. In remembering Belzec, humanity reclaims truth from the shadow of oblivion. In the 1990s, Belzec emerged from decades of silence when archaeologists began systematic excavations at the site. These investigations were prompted by growing international awareness that Belzec had been almost completely erased. Unlike Auschwitz or Majdanek, no barracks, fences, or crematoria remained above ground. The Nazis had dismantled the camp in 1942, planting trees and constructing a farmhouse to disguise its past. Yet survivors, historians, and families of victims demanded that the truth be revealed. Polish and international teams of archaeologists responded, determined to uncover what remained beneath the soil. Their work was both scientific and sacred, balancing forensic methodology with profound respect for the dead. Excavations began cautiously, with small surveys to determine the extent of buried remains. What they uncovered would transform understanding of Belzec's scale. The earth itself spoke, revealing the enormity of mass murder. The excavations were led by Polish archaeologist Professor Andrzej Kola, whose team approached Belzec with both precision and reverence. Their primary tool was core drilling, which allowed samples to be taken without disturbing human remains. Through hundreds of boreholes, they mapped the subsurface structure of the site. Each core revealed layers of soil mixed with ash, charred wood, and fragments of bone. The team identified 33 separate mass graves, ranging in size and depth, scattered across the extermination area. Some pits measured over 60 feet in length and more than 20 feet deep, filled with cremated remains and human ash. Others contained unburned bodies, preserved in anaerobic conditions. This chilling evidence confirmed that the Nazis' efforts to destroy all traces had not been complete. The graves provided the first tangible proof of Belzec's killing scale. Archaeology had given voice to the victims who could not speak. The discovery of human remains forced archaeologists into ethical dilemmas, as Jewish religious law prohibits the disturbance of graves. To respect halakhic tradition, the team avoided full excavation of burial pits. Instead, they documented findings through non-invasive methods, carefully extracting soil cores for analysis. Even these limited samples contained fragments of bones, teeth, and human ash, mixed with layers of sand and lime. Lime had been used by the Nazis in an attempt to accelerate decomposition and suppress odor. Archaeologists also identified traces of wooden structures, likely remnants of cremation pyres built during the camp's dismantling. Forensic analysis confirmed the presence of burned human fat in soil layers, consistent with open-air cremation practices. The evidence was devastating in its clarity, leaving no doubt about the nature of Belzec. Every borehole was a reminder of human lives extinguished. The camp's silence was broken by the language of the soil. In addition to mass graves, archaeologists uncovered traces of the camp's infrastructure. Foundations of buildings, post holes, and fence lines revealed the layout of Belzec's two zones, the reception area and the extermination area. Pathways identified in the soil matched survivor descriptions of the Schlag, the fenced corridor that forced prisoners toward the gas chambers. Remains of wooden posts and barbed wire fragments confirmed the oppressive enclosure of the camp. Fragments of tiles and nails suggested the location of gas chamber structures, though the buildings themselves were long gone. Archaeologists also discovered artifacts belonging to victims, including buttons, keys, coins, and personal items. These objects were often charred or corroded, yet they carried deep emotional weight. Each artifact represented a stolen life and a silenced story. The camp's physical traces, once hidden, had resurfaced with undeniable clarity. Archaeology restored the contours of a place designed to vanish. The scale of death revealed by the graves was staggering and aligned with transport records uncovered by historians. Estimates confirmed that approximately 500,000 victims had been murdered at Belzec between March and December 1942. The sheer size of burial pits, filled with ash and bone fragments, demonstrated industrialized killing on a vast scale. Forensic analysis suggested that tens of thousands were buried in individual graves before being later exhumed and burned. Archaeologists observed evidence of soil disturbance consistent with these operations, known as Sonderaction 1005, the Nazi campaign to erase evidence of genocide. Despite these efforts, the ground preserved its testimony. Even microscopic analysis revealed traces of human remains in every layer of soil sampled. The findings gave scientific weight to survivor testimonies, long dismissed by deniers. Numbers that had once seemed abstract now had physical confirmation. The camp's enormity could no longer be obscured. Local villagers, long aware of the camp's horrors, had their memories validated by the excavations. Many recalled smoke and odor from burning bodies drifting over the countryside in 1942. They spoke of trainloads of Jews arriving almost daily, with none ever seen leaving. For decades, such oral histories were dismissed as anecdotal or exaggerated. The archaeological evidence now confirmed their truth with irrefutable precision. Graves matched the locations villagers remembered, and burned soil layers corresponded to their accounts of cremation pyres. The villagers' testimonies thus gained new weight, forming a bridge between lived memory and forensic science. Their voices, once marginalized, were amplified by archaeology. This blending of local memory and physical evidence created a fuller understanding of Belzec. The camp's horrors were no longer whispers of the past, but documented realities. Memory and science converged to preserve truth. The excavations also revealed the Nazi obsession with concealment. Soil analysis showed how carefully the ground had been leveled and replanted after the camp's destruction. The farmhouse built on site was positioned to disguise traces of former barracks and cremation areas. Yet despite these efforts, the Nazis could not erase every layer of evidence. Archaeology revealed their failure, exposing the futility of trying to bury genocide beneath the earth. The findings highlighted how genocide is not only an act of killing, but also an attempt to obliterate memory. Belzec stood as a case study of both extermination and concealment. The evidence left behind, however fragile, outlived the perpetrators. In uncovering these traces, archaeologists defeated the Nazi project of silence. Belzec's soil became its most enduring witness. The archaeological discoveries of the 1990s transformed the historical narrative of Belzec. They provided concrete, scientific confirmation of survivor testimonies, documentary evidence, and transport records. They also reshaped public commemoration, guiding the design of the memorial site built in the early 2000s. The mass graves were left undisturbed but marked within the new memorial landscape, turning the entire ground into a sacred cemetery. Forensic findings also enriched Holocaust education, providing stark proof against denial. They showed that even when camps were dismantled, history remained embedded in the earth itself. Belzec's excavations became a symbol of how memory can be reclaimed through science. They bridged the gap between silence and remembrance, invisibility and visibility. The forgotten death camp was finally given physical presence through its soil. In its silence, Belzec had spoken louder than ever before. Today, the Belzec Memorial Site stands as both a cemetery and a museum, a place where silence speaks louder than words. It was not until the late 1990s that serious efforts were made to transform the site into a dignified memorial. For decades after the war, the camp remained neglected, with only a modest stone plaque marking the ground where 500,000 people had perished. Grass, trees, and farmland covered what had once been a center of mass murder, leaving visitors with little sense of the magnitude of tragedy. Survivors and historians repeatedly called for proper recognition, arguing that Belzec deserved the same attention as Auschwitz and Treblinka. Finally, an international effort led by Poland's Council for the Protection of Memory of Combat and Martyrdom, in cooperation with Jewish organizations, began planning a permanent memorial. The project aimed not only to commemorate the dead, but also to educate future generations. Construction began in the early 2000s, and the site was inaugurated in 2004. What emerged was not a typical museum, but a profound landscape of memory. It turned absence itself into testimony. The memorial's architecture is striking in its symbolism, designed by Polish artists Andrzej Selwiga, Zdzisław Pidek, and Marcin Roszczyk. Instead of rebuilding lost barracks or gas chambers, they chose to convey memory through form and atmosphere. The entire extermination area was enclosed within massive walls of rust-colored stone, creating the sense of an open grave. Visitors descend into a long, narrow pathway, cut deep into the earth, symbolizing both the descent into death and the claustrophobic path victims once walked. The walls rise higher as the corridor narrows, pressing inward with oppressive weight. At its darkest point, the path ends abruptly at a towering wall, inscribed with the names of towns and cities whose Jews were murdered at Belzec. Beyond, a vast field of jagged black rock covers the area where mass graves lie, undisturbed but forever marked. The design is deliberately stark, forcing visitors to confront absence and silence rather than reconstructed illusions. It is a landscape of memory where the earth itself speaks. The heart of the memorial is the symbolic cemetery, covering the ground beneath which lie the 33 identified mass graves. No individual graves are visible. No names carved in stone for specific victims. Instead, the entire field becomes a single, vast tomb. The use of dark basalt stone conveys both permanence and mourning, evoking the ash and destruction of lives burned. Narrow fissures cut into the rock suggest ruptured lives and broken communities. Visitors walking across the uneven terrain feel instability beneath their feet, a reminder of the disrupted existence of those who perished. At the edges, the site is bordered by steel walls that encircle the space, enclosing visitors in the silence of death. The cemetery is not meant to comfort, but to confront, forcing reflection on scale and loss. In its design, it rejects closure and instead embodies the endlessness of grief. The symbolic cemetery makes the invisible visible. Complementing the memorial landscape is the Belzec Museum of the History of the Nazi Extermination Camp. Built adjacent to the cemetery, unlike larger Holocaust museums, its exhibition is compact, designed to preserve the site's solemnity rather than overwhelm it with artifacts. Inside, visitors encounter documents, photographs, and survivor testimonies that reconstruct Belzec's story. Multimedia presentations trace the history of Operation Reinhard and the specific function of Belzec within it. The museum highlights rare accounts from the few survivors, emphasizing the scarcity of direct testimony. Personal artifacts unearthed during archaeological investigations are displayed with careful reverence, each object bearing witness to a silenced life. The museum also explores broader themes of Holocaust denial, remembrance, and the ethics of representation. It balances education with commemoration, ensuring that history is neither forgotten nor abstracted. Every aspect is designed to amplify the voices of victims through context and memory. The museum gives the silent ground a voice. For visitors, the experience of Belzec is profoundly unsettling yet deeply necessary. The descent into the memorial corridor evokes physical unease, a visceral reminder of the journey victims made toward their deaths. The overwhelming silence of the symbolic cemetery demands quiet reflection, stripping away distractions. Unlike other sites, Belzec does not overwhelm with artifacts or reconstructions. It confronts through absence. Many visitors describe a sense of suffocation and despair, emotions intentionally evoked by the architecture. Guided tours and educational programs contextualize the site, ensuring that visitors understand not only what happened but why remembrance matters. School groups, scholars, and international delegations regularly visit, making Belzec part of global Holocaust education. Survivors' families often describe the site as a sacred cemetery, a place where prayers and remembrance can finally take root. The visitor experience is designed not to offer comfort, but to provoke responsibility. In its silence, Belzec teaches. Educational programs at Belzec aim to ensure that the camp's lessons extend beyond its physical boundaries. The memorial works with Polish schools and international organizations to develop curricula on the Holocaust. Workshops combine archival materials, testimonies, and site visits, creating immersive learning experiences. Teachers receive training on how to approach the subject of genocide with sensitivity and accuracy. For younger audiences, the focus is on personal stories, individual victims who embody the human cost of abstract statistics. For scholars, the site offers archives and research facilities to deepen understanding of Operation Reinhard. International partnerships bring students from Israel, the United States, and across Europe, transforming Belzec into a center of transnational memory. Conferences and seminars also confront contemporary issues such as genocide prevention and the dangers of denial. Education ensures that Belzec is not only a place of mourning, but also of learning. Through these programs, the past becomes a warning for the future. Belzec's place in Holocaust memory is unique because of its near erasure and later rediscovery. For decades, it was overshadowed by Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek, whose ruins were more visible and whose survivors were more numerous. Yet Belzec's scale of death, 500,000 victims, makes it one of the deadliest sites of the Holocaust. The fact that fewer than 10 survivors lived to tell the story gave it an aura of silence, a void in collective memory. The memorial has changed this, turning absence into presence. It ensures that Belzec is no longer forgotten, but recognized as central to the machinery of extermination. Holocaust historians now emphasize Belzec alongside the better-known camps, correcting decades of neglect. Survivor organizations have praised the memorial for finally honoring those who perished without voices. Belzec's place in Holocaust memory is thus one of both tragedy and restoration. Its silence has become part of global remembrance. Ultimately, the Belzec Memorial today is not just a monument to the past, but a warning to the present. It stands as evidence against denial, an unanswerable testimony in stone and soil. The design forces visitors to confront how modern societies can descend into industrialized murder. By refusing to comfort, it ensures that remembrance is active, not passive. It challenges each generation to grapple with responsibility to remember, to teach, and to prevent recurrence. The memorial transforms a site of destruction into a place of conscience. Survivors' rare testimonies are amplified by the memorial's architecture, ensuring their voices echo into the future. The barren field of stone does not offer closure, but demands vigilance. Belzec today is both grave and classroom, both silence and voice. In remembering Belzec, humanity remembers the cost of forgetting. Belzec was not the largest of the Nazi camps, nor the most famous, but it was among the most efficient instruments of death. In less than a year of full operation, it consumed 500,000 lives, mostly Jews, with a speed and ruthlessness that still shocks historians. Its machinery was deceptively simple: trains, gas chambers, pits, and yet it was devastatingly effective. Belzec was a prototype for extermination, a test case that proved to the Nazi leadership that mass killing could be industrialized. Its lessons in cruelty were carried forward into Treblinka and Sobibor, expanding the reach of Operation Reinhard. Unlike Auschwitz, which combined labor and extermination, Belzec existed solely for death, giving it a singularly grim distinction. Every arrival meant extermination. There was no selection for work, no survival by chance. This absolute finality makes Belzec a chilling symbol of Nazi intent. It was the embodiment of genocide distilled to its purest form. In remembering Belzec, we confront the Holocaust at its most uncompromising. The silence surrounding Belzec for decades after the war reflects both the nature of its destruction and the scarcity of survivors. Where Auschwitz left barracks and crematoria as evidence, Belzec left only soil, ash, and faint scars on the landscape. The Nazis dismantled the camp in late 1942, erasing buildings and burning corpses in an attempt to hide the crime. With fewer than 10 known survivors, there were few voices to tell the world what had happened. In this silence, Belzec risked being forgotten, a void in Holocaust memory. Only scattered testimonies, fragments of documents, and the memories of villagers kept its story alive. Historians struggled for decades to reconstruct its reality, piecing together a puzzle with most of its pieces deliberately destroyed. This absence is itself part of Belzec's lesson that silence can bury truth if vigilance fails. Memory requires constant renewal, or else atrocity slips into obscurity. Belzec teaches us that forgetting is as dangerous as denial. Denial has always lurked in the shadows of Holocaust history, and Belzec's silence provided fertile ground for it. Without abundant survivors to testify, deniers claimed exaggeration or fabrication, exploiting the scarcity of first-hand voices. Yet archaeology, forensic evidence, and contemporary German documents refuted these lies. Excavations revealed the vast mass graves, confirming the scale of killing beyond doubt. Testimonies from the few survivors, however scarce, were invaluable in reconstructing the camp's operation. The trials of perpetrators, though limited, added further confirmation, documenting names, roles, and crimes. Belzec thus underscores the importance of testimony, not only from survivors, but from every form of evidence available, against denial. Memory must be anchored in fact and truth. Belzec warns us that history can be distorted when silence dominates. Its lesson is that vigilance against distortion is as vital as remembrance itself. The importance of Belzec lies not only in its history, but in its meaning for humanity. It reminds us how swiftly ideology, bureaucracy, and obedience can combine into genocide. Ordinary rail workers, administrators, and guards contributed to extraordinary evil without hesitation. Local populations witnessed trains and smoke, often powerless, sometimes complicit, always touched by the enormity. Belzec demonstrates how genocide requires not only planners, but also participants and bystanders. It reveals how states can mobilize everyday structures, railways, records, uniforms, into instruments of destruction. More chillingly, it shows how killing can be hidden, silenced, and nearly erased. Belzec is thus both a place of history and a mirror held up to societies everywhere. Its legacy warns us of the fragility of morality under authoritarian rule. It is a reminder that vigilance is humanity's only safeguard against repetition. For survivors and descendants, Belzec represents a wound that can never fully heal. The absence of graves for loved ones denies families the closure of mourning. Names carved into walls at the memorial stand in place of the countless who vanished without a trace. Survivors' rare testimonies resonate with raw pain, describing last sights of families, desperate moments, and unimaginable fear. Their words remind us that the Holocaust is not numbers but human lives, each story a world extinguished. In hearing them, we are charged with carrying memory forward. The silence of Belzec obliges us to amplify those voices so they are never lost again. The task of remembrance falls to us all, across generations and nations. In listening, repeating, and teaching, we resist erasure. Belzec's lesson is that memory itself is an act of resistance. The legacy of Belzec is also global, extending beyond Jewish memory to universal human responsibility. It stands as a warning of what hatred, racism, and authoritarianism can unleash when unchecked. Its existence challenges every society to confront prejudice and violence before they escalate. In classrooms and memorials, Belzec is taught not only as Jewish history, but as human history. Its lessons inform discussions on genocide prevention, human rights, and the dangers of indifference. By studying Belzec, we learn not only about the past, but about the conditions that make such horrors possible. In this way, Belzec becomes a guide for vigilance in the present. It reminds us that atrocity begins with words, policies, and silence long before it ends with gas chambers. The camp's legacy is not confined to Poland but belongs to the world. Belzec's enduring message is that prevention is the highest form of remembrance. Visiting Belzec today, One cannot escape the weight of silence and absence that defines the memorial. The symbolic cemetery, the rust-red walls, the jagged stone field, all speak without words of destruction and loss. Standing there, visitors feel both the enormity of death and the emptiness left in its wake. The design resists closure, instead leaving questions that echo long after departure. What does it mean to live after such death? How can humanity ensure it never repeats? The memorial forces these questions into the present, demanding reflection rather than offering comfort. In this way, Belzec is not only a memorial, but a dialogue between past and present. Its silence speaks more powerfully than monuments of stone or bronze. At Belzec, remembrance becomes responsibility. In conclusion, Belzec is a lesson carved into history and into conscience. It teaches us that evil can be efficient, that silence can be complicit, and that memory must be defended at all costs. It shows us that genocide is not the work of monsters alone, but of systems, structures, and ordinary people who follow orders. Belzec warns us that forgetting is the first step to repeating. Its legacy is not only for the Jewish people, but for all humanity, reminding us of the dangers of hatred and indifference. To remember Belzec is to accept the duty of vigilance and empathy. It is to honor the dead by shaping a future where such crimes cannot flourish. The camp that once sought to erase lives now demands that their memory endure. Belzec's final lesson is that remembrance is resistance, and resistance is survival. In its silence, it speaks forever.